Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spook Speaks. I know many of you tune in to these videos to help you to sleep, so I thought it would be a fun idea for everyone to share where you're listening from in the world. Feel free to drop a comment below, and if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get cozy and relaxed. Let's begin. Story 1. I've always believed that old houses have a life of their own. Some people laugh at that, saying it's just my imagination, but the feeling I get when I walk into a place with history, like the walls have seen too much, is something I can't shake. That's exactly what crossed my mind when I first stepped into the cottage. It was small, cozy even, nestled just on the edge of a quiet town, the kind of place people go to when they want to escape the rush of the world. After weeks of stressful work and deadlines, Ethan and I needed a break, and this Airbnb seemed like the perfect retreat. From the outside, it looked charming. A white picket fence, ivy creeping up the stone walls, and flowers blooming in wild bursts along the path. But there was something about it, something that made me feel like I was stepping into a place that had been waiting for me. Waiting a little too eagerly. "Cozy, isn't it?" Ethan said, dropping his bags just inside the door. His eyes were already scanning the place, calculating which room had the best view of the garden. Ethan never noticed the strange things I did about houses. To him, a place was a place. As long as it had a bed and a roof, he didn't care about its energy, or whatever it was that seemed to breathe under the surface of this cottage. I gave him a smile, trying to shake off the unease, and followed him inside. The entryway opened into a quaint living room with vintage furniture, a stone fireplace, and old black and white photographs lining the walls. It smelled like aged wood and something faintly sweet, like lavender, mixed with dust. Ethan was already unpacking, but my gaze wandered to the ceiling. There was a strange creaking sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above us. I frowned and tilted my head, trying to pinpoint the source. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet house. "Hear what?" Ethan said, pausing mid-step, his hands full of groceries. "That noise. From upstairs." He raised an eyebrow. "Probably just the house settling. These old places are full of weird sounds. Come help me unpack." But the sound didn't seem like the typical creaks of an old house. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was pacing. I turned my attention to the ceiling again, a strange sense of foreboding washing over me. The listing hadn't mentioned an attic, but I was certain the footsteps were coming from directly above. Ignoring the growing tightness in my chest, I helped Ethan with the groceries, trying to force myself into the rhythm of unpacking and organizing, but my thoughts kept drifting upward. Something about this place felt off, and I couldn't shake it. After a while, we settled into a comfortable routine. The cottage had everything we needed for a peaceful weekend. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just quiet. The first night was uneventful, filled with wine and the crackling of a fire, as we talked about everything except the things that had been stressing us out for weeks. It should have been perfect, but my mind was elsewhere. As we got ready for bed, I hesitated by the staircase leading up to the second floor. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't help but feel watched. "I'll be up in a sec," I told Ethan as he headed toward the bedroom. "I'm just going to check something." He gave me a curious look, but didn't argue. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to investigate now, but something was pulling me, beckoning me toward the attic, even though I couldn't see it yet. The house was eerily silent as I crept up the stairs, the wood groaning under my weight. At the top, there was a narrow hallway with a few doors. Guest rooms, probably. But what caught my attention was the small, almost hidden door at the far end of the hall. The attic. It wasn't locked, but the door seemed stuck, as if it hadn't been opened in years. With a bit of effort, I managed to pry it open, and the smell hit me immediately. A musty, stale scent mixed with something else. Something metallic. I fumbled for a light switch, but there was none. The only light came from the moon, filtering through a small round window near the roof. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, dusty trunks, and stacks of yellowing newspapers. But what drew my eyes wasn't the clutter. It was the mirror. A large, antique mirror stood at the far end of the attic, leaning against the wall as if someone had left it there in a hurry. The glass was fogged with age, but as I stepped closer, I could see my reflection, distorted and strange, like the glass was rippling. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling slightly. That's when I saw it. A figure. Just behind me. A woman, standing in the shadows, her face obscured, but her eyes, those cold, dark eyes, were locked onto mine through the reflection. I spun around, heart pounding, but the attic was empty. Breathing hard, I turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, closer now, her face twisted in a grotesque, almost mocking smile. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes as panic surged through me. And then the mirror cracked. A thin, jagged line appeared down the center of the glass, splitting my reflection in two. The sound echoed in the silence, a sharp, shattering noise that sent chills down my spine. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing in my chest. Ethan met me at the top of the stairs, concern etched across his face. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain what I'd just seen? The figure in the mirror, the feeling that something in that attic was watching me, waiting for me to return. I don't know," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's something wrong with this house." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around us. Every creak, every groan, every whisper of wind through the cracks made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, the ones I had heard earlier, slow, deliberate, pacing just above us. Ethan, of course, had no such trouble. He slept soundly beside me, his soft breathing the only thing that anchored me to reality. I tried to focus on that sound, on the rhythm of his breaths, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the attic, to the mirror, to the woman. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a reflection of something in the room behind me that had made it look like someone was there. I had always been sensitive to places like this. Too sensitive, according to Ethan. He often joked that I should have been a ghost hunter instead of a graphic designer. But this was different. This felt real. Morning came slowly, the pale light filtering through the thin curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. I had barely slept, but I didn't feel tired. Instead, I felt wired, like my nerves were stretched too thin, ready to snap at any moment. Ethan woke up with a yawn, stretching his arms over his head as if nothing in the world could bother him. I envied his ability to shut out the world so easily. He glanced over at me, noticing the dark circles under my eyes. "You didn't sleep?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" I hesitated. What could I tell him? That I had seen a ghost? That I had stood in front of an antique mirror and watched as a woman who wasn't there stared back at me? He'd never believe it. I couldn't get comfortable," I said instead, avoiding his eyes. "Old house, noisy." He nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, these places are like that. You want to head into town today? Grab some breakfast? Clear your head?" I did, but not for the reasons he thought. I needed to get out of this house, even if just for a little while. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were watching me. "Yeah, that sounds good." We left the cottage not long after, and the moment I stepped outside, I felt like I could breathe again. The town wasn't far, a quaint little village with narrow streets and small shops. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where time seemed to move slower, unbothered by the chaos of the outside world. The cafe we found was cozy, with mismatched chairs and tables that added to its charm. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and for the first time since arriving at the cottage, I felt a sense of normalcy. Ethan ordered us breakfast while I found a table by the window, watching the world go by. It was peaceful, quiet, but even as I sat there, sipping my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman from the attic standing in the doorway, but of course, she wasn't there. "Hey," Ethan said, breaking me out of my thoughts as he set a plate of food in front of me. "You okay? You're quiet this morning." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Didn't get much sleep, remember?" He nodded, taking a bite of his toast. "Maybe tonight will be better. We'll have some wine, relax by the fire. That always helps." I wanted to believe him, but I knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was something wrong with that house, and I wasn't sure a glass of wine would be enough to fix it. As we ate, I overheard a conversation from the table next to us. Two elderly women were chatting, their voices low but distinct enough that I could make out the words. Strange things happening up at the old Ashford place again. They should have just left it alone, if you ask me. My heart skipped a beat. The Ashford place? Was that the cottage we were staying in? I heard about that, the other woman replied, her voice tinged with concern. Ever since they rented it out, people have been complaining. Strange noises, things moving on their own. Some say it's haunted. I leaned in slightly, trying to hear more without being obvious. Ethan was too engrossed in his breakfast to notice. Haunted? The first woman scoffed. More likely the place has just fallen apart. But there was that business with the old woman, wasn't there? The second woman nodded. Yes, back in the 60s I think it was. Poor thing went mad. They found her up in the attic, never figured out what happened to her. My blood ran cold. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, my mind racing. The attic. The woman in the attic. Suddenly, I didn't feel hungry anymore. We left the cafe shortly after, and the walk back to the cottage felt like a march toward something inevitable. I couldn't stop thinking about what those women had said. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? The woman I'd seen in the mirror, was it her? By the time we reached the cottage, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden. I stared up at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing in one of them, watching us. But the house remained still, quiet. Why don't you take a nap? Ethan suggested, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. You didn't sleep much last night. I'll make us dinner later, and we'll have a relaxing evening, okay? I nodded, even though the last thing I wanted to do was sleep. But I couldn't tell Ethan the truth. He'd laugh it off, say it was just my imagination. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, my legs feeling heavy with each step. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, but I forced myself to walk past it, keeping my eyes down. I didn't want to think about what was up there. As I lay down on the bed, I told myself I would just rest for a while, not sleep. But exhaustion finally caught up with me, and before I knew it, my eyes were closing. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. I must have slept longer than I intended. For a moment I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the attic. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The woman. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was pacing directly above me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the bed, as the sounds continued. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay there, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the house was still again, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see it creak open, but it remained closed. It's just my imagination, I told myself. I'm just overtired. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The footsteps weren't my imagination, and neither was the woman in the mirror. I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, afraid to move. My ears were trained on the ceiling, waiting for the slightest sound, but the house was silent again. Too silent. I wanted to believe that it was over, that I had just been dreaming, but the pounding of my heart wouldn't let me rest. Finally, I forced myself to get out of bed. I didn't dare go near the attic door. Instead, I crept downstairs, careful not to make any noise, even though I knew Ethan would probably laugh if he saw me acting so cautiously. He was in the living room, stretched out on the couch with his feet up, his laptop balanced on his knees. He didn't notice me at first, completely absorbed in whatever he was watching, probably one of those endless documentary series he loved. It was comforting to see him so relaxed, as if the house didn't have the same grip on him that it did on me. But I knew better. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding too quiet, even to my own ears. He glanced up and smiled. "Hey, you're awake. Feeling any better?" I shrugged, crossing my arms over my chest. "I guess. What time is it?" "Almost 8. I figured I'd let you sleep a little longer before dinner." He was trying so hard to make this weekend perfect for us, to give me a break from the stress of work and the exhaustion I carried with me every day. But this house, this place, it was making me feel worse than I had before. I didn't want to ruin the weekend for him, but how could I tell him about the footsteps without sounding like I was losing it? "Thanks," I mumbled. "I appreciate it." He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. "You sure you're okay? You look, I don't know, kind of pale." "I didn't sleep much," I admitted, sinking down into the armchair across from him. "I kept hearing noises." Ethan frowned. "Noises? Like what?" I hesitated. "Footsteps, coming from the attic." He blinked, then let out a short laugh. "Footsteps? In the attic? You've got to be kidding me." My stomach twisted at his reaction, but I couldn't blame him. I knew how it sounded. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but I heard them last night and again while I was trying to nap. Someone was walking around up there. Ethan shook his head, the smile fading from his lips as he leaned forward, setting his laptop aside. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't hear something, but it's an old house, babe. Old houses make noises all the time. The wood shifts, the pipes creak. That's probably all it was." He stood up, crossing the room to where I sat, and rested his hands on my shoulders, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're just stressed, that's all. We came here to relax, remember?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that all this was just in my head, that I was overreacting. But I knew what I'd heard, and I couldn't shake the image of that woman in the mirror. "You're probably right," I muttered, even though I didn't fully believe it. "Of course I am," he said with a grin, kissing the top of my head. "Now, why don't I make us some dinner, something warm and comforting, and later we can sit by the fire with some wine and just enjoy ourselves, okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, that sounds good." Ethan disappeared into the kitchen, humming to himself as he started preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs soon filled the air, the comforting aroma easing some of my tension. But even as I sat there, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, my thoughts kept drifting back to the attic. Dinner was delicious. Ethan had a knack for cooking, and the hearty pasta dish he made was just what I needed to ground myself for a little while. We talked about mundane things, work, friends, plans for the future. For a moment, it almost felt like we were back to normal, like the house wasn't getting to me. But as the night wore on, the tension I had been trying to suppress began creeping back in. We sat in front of the fire, sipping wine in silence. Ethan was scrolling through his phone, completely at ease, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the stairs, half expecting to see the attic door swing open on its own. The thought of that made my skin crawl. "Hey," Ethan said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. "I was thinking, tomorrow we should go hiking. There's that nature trail nearby. It'll be good to get some fresh air." "Sure," I said, my voice sounding distant. I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was still on the attic. He reached over, squeezing my hand. "You're really out of it, huh?" I looked at him and tried to smile. "Yeah, I guess I am. Sorry, The sound of a thud interrupted me, making us both freeze. It came from upstairs. Ethan glanced toward the ceiling, frowning. "What was that?" he asked, standing up. My heart was pounding again, my pulse quickening with fear. "That's what I've been hearing," I whispered. Without a word, Ethan started toward the stairs. "Wait," I called after him, getting to my feet. "Don't." He turned back to me, a half-amused smile on his face. "It's probably just a loose board or something. I'll check it out. Stay here." I didn't want to be alone, but I didn't want to follow him upstairs either. Every part of me screamed that something bad was waiting up there. But Ethan wasn't worried. He climbed the stairs, disappearing from view as I stood frozen in the living room, my mind racing. The minutes stretched on. I stared up at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement, but the house was eerily silent again. Too silent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I headed for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step making the old wood creak beneath my feet. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window at the far end. The attic door was still closed, but the silence felt suffocating. "Ethan?" I called again, my voice barely a whisper now. I reached the top of the stairs and stood there, my eyes locked on the attic door. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the house, like I was the only person left in the world. And then I heard it. A soft creaking sound, followed by a slow, deliberate knock. It came from behind the attic door. Knock, knock, knock. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Ethan?" I whispered, though I knew it wasn't him. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of something, or someone, moving inside the attic. I turned and ran. I practically flew down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I raced back into the living room. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep my grip on the railing. I was halfway to the door when Ethan came down the stairs behind me, his face confused and worried. Whoa, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing to my side. I stopped short, staring at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, what's wrong? Where were you? I called for you, and then I heard." Ethan blinked, holding up his hands. "I went upstairs, checked the attic. Nothing was up there. I came down and was looking for you. You didn't hear me?" I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. You went up to the attic? And nothing happened?" He shook his head, looking genuinely confused. "No, there was nothing up there, just a bunch of old junk. Maybe you're overtired, babe. Come on, let's sit down." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I had heard the knocking, that something had been up there. But the look on his face told me he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I let him guide me back to the couch, where I sat in silence, my hands still trembling. Ethan made some tea, and we drank it together, but my mind was far from calm. The house felt different now, heavier. I didn't trust the silence. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Ethan was out cold, his soft snores filling the room, but I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The sound of footsteps started again just after midnight. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from the attic again. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen, listening to each step. I glanced over at Ethan, who was still asleep, completely unaware of the sounds above us. I wanted to wake him, to tell him that the noises had returned, but part of me was afraid of his reaction. What if he thought I was imagining it all? What if he dismissed it as the house settling like before? But this time, I couldn't brush it off. The footsteps were too real, too close. I slid out of bed, moving carefully so I wouldn't wake him. My legs felt like jelly as I crossed the room and crept into the hallway. The attic door loomed at the end, half hidden in the shadows, and the closer I got, the heavier the air around me seemed to become. I stood there, staring at the door, my heart racing in my chest. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel something on the other side. Something waiting. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to bed, pretended none of this was happening. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was behind that door. What was causing the footsteps? My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold beneath my fingers, sending a shiver down my spine. Slowly I turned it, half expecting the door to resist, but it opened smoothly, creaking softly as it swung inward. The darkness inside the attic was thick, almost suffocating. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers shaking as they brushed against the wall. The bulb overhead flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the dusty space. It was just as Ethan had described it. A bunch of old, forgotten junk. Boxes stacked haphazardly, covered in thick layers of dust. An old rocking chair in the corner, still as death. A few pieces of furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets. It looked like no one had set foot in here for years. But I knew better. Someone or something had been up here. I had heard the footsteps. I wasn't crazy. I stepped inside, my feet stirring up the dust as I moved deeper into the attic. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pushing down on me from all sides. I glanced around, half expecting to see the woman from the mirror standing in the corner, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. But the attic was empty. I let out a shaky breath, my pulse still racing. Maybe Ethan had been right. Maybe it was just the house settling, the old wood creaking under its own weight. Maybe I was just overtired, my imagination getting the better of me. But then I heard it again, a soft creak. Then another. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the far corner of the attic. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no one there, just the empty rocking chair, swaying slightly as if someone had just stood up from it. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but I couldn't see anything. I turned to run, but something cold and invisible brushed against my arm, stopping me in my tracks. I gasped, stumbling back, my eyes wide with terror. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing. No one. And then I heard the voice, soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough that I could make out the words. "Help me." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The voice was coming from the mirror, the old ornate mirror that hung on the wall near the rocking chair, its surface covered in a layer of grime. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see her again. But something compelled me to turn, to face the mirror. Through the dust and dirt, I saw her. The woman from before. She stood in the reflection, her pale face just barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes, hollow and dark, stared back at me, filled with a sadness that made my stomach churn. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, and I could see her lips moving, though no sound came out. "Help me!" My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing. I didn't understand. What did she want? Why was she here? I took a step closer to the mirror, my legs shaking beneath me. What do you need?" The woman's eyes flickered, her expression shifting from sorrow to something darker, something more desperate. Her lips parted again, and this time the words were louder, more forceful. "Help me. Escape." Before I could react, the glass of the mirror cracked, a thin fracture snaking its way across the surface. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. I turned and bolted for the door, my feet barely touching the ground as I fled down the stairs. My mind was a blur, my body running on pure instinct. I had to get out of there. I had to get away from that attic. I reached the bedroom, gasping for breath, and shook Ethan awake. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. "Right now." Ethan blinked groggily, sitting up. What are you talking about?" "I saw her again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "In the mirror. She's real, Ethan. We have to leave this house." His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Babe, calm down. You're scaring me." "I'm not crazy," I insisted, grabbing his arm. "Please, we have to go." Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't believe me, not fully. But he could see how terrified I was. With a sigh, he swung his legs out of bed and stood up. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's go. We'll pack up and leave tonight, okay?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. We packed quickly, throwing our clothes and belongings into our bags with shaking hands. I kept glancing toward the attic stairs, half expecting the woman to appear at the top, watching us. But the house remained silent. As we made our way to the front door, Ethan paused, looking up at the attic one last time. "You sure you saw something?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm sure." He didn't say anything else, just nodded and opened the door. We stepped out into the cool night air, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe again. But as we climbed into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something, or someone, was watching us from the house. As Ethan started the engine and pulled away from the cottage, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The attic window was dark, but in the reflection, I saw her. The woman standing there watching us leave. And this time, she wasn't alone. There was something else behind her. Something darker, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It stood just beyond the edge of the light, its form twisted and unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. I looked away, my heart racing. I didn't want to know what it was. All I knew was that we had to get as far away from that house as possible. The drive away from the house felt like an eternity. Every mile we put between us and that cursed place should have eased my nerves, but my heart still raced, and my mind refused to calm. The image of the woman and that thing behind her was burned into my thoughts. Ethan glanced over at me as he drove, concern etched into his features. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I tell him that it wasn't just the woman in the attic, that there was something far worse lurking in the shadows behind her? "I don't know," I muttered. I don't know." We drove in silence for a while longer, the only sound coming from the hum of the engine and the occasional thump as we hit a bump in the road. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape, and the further we drove, the more isolated the world around us became. We hadn't seen another car in ages. "Where are we going?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. I figured we'd head to that little motel we passed on the way here. It's only about an hour away. We can stay there tonight, get some sleep, and figure out what to do in the morning. I nodded, though the thought of sleeping in another unfamiliar place filled me with dread. Still, it was better than staying at the house. Anything was better than that. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. But the road remained empty, just an endless stretch of asphalt winding through the dark countryside. Finally, we saw the dim glow of the motel's neon sign in the distance, flickering like a beacon in the night. Ethan pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel as we came to a stop. The motel was small and rundown, the kind of place you'd only stay at if you had no other options. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the walls, and the neon sign buzzed faintly, one of the letters flickering on and off. Ethan killed the engine and turned to me. "I'll go check us in. You stay here." I nodded, my eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. It was deserted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself gripping the edge of my seat, my knuckles white. Ethan disappeared into the small office, leaving me alone in the car. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the lot. I whipped my head around, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. Ethan returned a few minutes later, jingling the keys in his hand. "Got us a room," he said, trying to sound upbeat. "It's not much, but it'll do for tonight." I forced a smile, though my nerves were still on edge. "Let's just get inside." We grabbed our bags from the car and made our way to the room, our footsteps echoing in the empty lot. The motel room was exactly what I expected, small, musty, and dimly lit. The bed was old, the linen scratchy, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. But it was a safe haven, at least for the night. Ethan tossed his bag onto the bed and stretched. "I'm gonna grab a shower. You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "Yeah, I'll be fine." He gave me a reassuring smile and disappeared into the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet beneath my feet, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The woman. And that thing behind her. What did she want? Why had she asked for help? And what was that thing lurking in the shadows, watching us with those cold, unseen eyes? I stood up, restless, and began pacing the room. My eyes kept drifting toward the mirror hanging on the wall near the bathroom. It wasn't as old or ornate as the one in the house, but it still unnerved me. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked into it too long, I'd see her again. Suddenly, a faint whisper broke the silence. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was so quiet that I almost thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was coming from the mirror. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see her. But something compelled me to move closer, to face the mirror. The reflection stared back at me. Just my own reflection. There was no woman, no shadowy figure. Just me. But the voice was still there, faint but persistent. "Help me." My heart raced as I stared at my own reflection, my mind spinning. Was I losing it? Was the stress of everything getting to me? Suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open, and Ethan stepped out, toweling his hair dry. He glanced at me, then at the mirror, frowning. "You okay?" I shook myself out of my trance, turning away from the mirror. "Yeah, I just thought I heard something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're okay? You've been acting really weird since we left the house." "I'm fine," I lied, my voice shaky. "It's just everything's catching up to me, I guess." He nodded, though he still looked concerned. "Let's just try to get some rest. We can figure things out in the morning." I nodded, though I knew sleep was the last thing I was going to get. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't as far from the house as I wanted to believe. That night, I dreamt of the attic. In my dream, I was back in the house, standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up at the attic door. The air was thick, heavy, and I could feel something waiting for me up there, just beyond the door. I didn't want to go up. Every instinct screamed for me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, carrying me up the stairs, step by step, until I was standing in front of the attic door once again. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark, empty room beyond. But this time, it wasn't empty. The woman was there, standing in the middle of the attic, her hollow eyes locked on mine. She reached out to me, her voice a faint whisper. "Help me." Before I could react, the shadows in the corner of the attic began to move. The thing, whatever it was, stepped out of the darkness, its form twisting and writhing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It reached for the woman, its long, twisted fingers wrapping around her throat. She gasped, her eyes widening in terror as she struggled against it. I wanted to move, to help her, but I was frozen in place, my body refusing to respond. The shadows grew darker, thicker, enveloping her as she let out one final, desperate plea. "Help me." I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I was drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark, but I could feel something, someone watching me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the mirror, and there she was, standing in the reflection, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving silently as she mouthed the words again. "Help me." The woman's face in the mirror lingered in my mind long after the image had faded. Even when I blinked, I could still see her terrified expression, her mouth forming those silent words. "Help me." I sat up in bed, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Ethan was still fast asleep beside me, oblivious to the terror that gripped me in the dead of night. The room was silent, but the air felt thick, as if the shadows themselves were pressing in on me. I glanced at the mirror again, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But the reflection only showed the dim motel room, lit by the faint glow of the parking lot lights outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was no way I was going back to sleep, not with my heart racing like this. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. Maybe a quick distraction, something mindless, would calm me down. But as I unlocked my phone, something strange caught my eye. There was a new message on my phone. That wouldn't have been alarming, except for the fact that there was no notification, no ping, no vibration, just a message waiting in my inbox, as though it had always been there. The sender was unknown, and the message itself was a single, cryptic line. "She is not the only one who needs help." I stared at the screen, my fingers shaking. The message had appeared out of nowhere, and I had no idea who could have sent it. No one else knew what was happening, not even Ethan. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. She's not the only one who needs help. Who else could there be, and who was sending me these warnings? I glanced at Ethan, who was still sleeping soundly, then back at the phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, uncertain of what to do. Should I reply? Should I delete it and pretend I'd never seen it? I didn't have time to make a decision, because the moment I thought of typing a response, another message popped up. "Come back." My heart skipped a beat. "Come back? To the house? To the attic?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not going back there." The phone buzzed again. "He will make you. You cannot escape him." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, my pulse thundering in my ears. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body trembling as the weight of the words sank in. "He will make you." I didn't know who he was, but I had a sinking feeling that it had something to do with the shadowy figure I had seen behind the woman. The thing in the attic, lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath in the cold air, small puffs of vapor hanging in front of me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and deepen, as if they were reaching toward me, pulling me into their darkness. I scrambled to my feet, backing up against the wall, my eyes darting around the room. Something was here. Something was watching me. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Ethan?" He didn't stir. "Ethan," I said louder this time, grabbing his arm and shaking him. He groaned and turned over, blinking groggily. "What's going on?" There's something, someone." I couldn't get the words out. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. All I could do was point toward the shadows gathering in the corner of the room. Ethan sat up, rubbing his eyes, then followed my gaze. He frowned, his eyes scanning the dark room. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing there." But I knew he was wrong. I could feel it, a presence just out of sight, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air was thick with its malevolence, and the coldness in the room was unlike anything I had ever felt before. The phone buzzed again. "He is here." That did it. I grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him out of bed. "We have to leave, now." "Babe, calm down," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You're freaking out. There's nothing here. Just take a deep breath." Before he could finish his sentence, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I gasped, stumbling backward, and Ethan cursed under his breath. The darkness was absolute, so thick it felt like it was suffocating us. I reached out, grabbing for Ethan, but my fingers only met empty air. "Ethan?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. No response. I fumbled in the darkness, trying to find him, but he was gone. The room felt different now, larger, emptier, like I was standing in a vast, cavernous space instead of a tiny motel room. The coldness was unbearable, seeping into my bones, and I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on me. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. The same footsteps I had heard in the attic. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew closer, each one louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the room. I could feel something moving toward me, something that didn't belong in this world. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but I could feel it. Him, standing just inches away from me, hidden in the darkness. A cold breath brushed against the back of my neck, and I froze, too terrified to move. "Help me," a voice whispered. But this time it wasn't the woman's voice. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, as the thing in the darkness reached for me. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the room snapped back into its normal, cramped reality. Ethan was standing by the door, looking at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice rising. I gasped, stumbling forward and grabbing his arm, my body shaking uncontrollably. "We need to get out of here. Now. He's here. He's here. Ethan." "Who's here?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "What are you talking about?" I didn't have time to explain. I dragged him toward the door, fumbling with the handle until it finally gave way, and we stumbled out into the cool night air. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the motel looming behind us like a silent specter. I didn't stop moving until we were back in the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his expression still filled with concern and frustration. "Okay, you seriously need to tell me what's going on," he said as he started the engine. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "We have to go? Just drive, please." He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed and put the car in gear, pulling out of the lot. The tires crunched on the gravel as we sped away from the motel, leaving the haunting shadows behind. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The shadowy figure, the thing in the attic, it wasn't bound to that house. It had followed us, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And I still didn't know what that was. The road stretched out in front of us, a dark, lonely ribbon cutting through the night. Ethan drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the empty landscape. The motel was long behind us, but the fear still clung to me, tightening its grip with every passing mile. I kept expecting to see something, him, in the rearview mirror. The figure from the attic, the thing that had followed us. My mind conjured images of him standing at the side of the road, watching as we passed, or worse, sitting in the back seat, silent and waiting. But every time I glanced back, the back seat was empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Ethan broke the silence first. "You need to tell me what's going on," he said, his voice low but insistent. "You're freaking out, and I don't know why. First the house, now the motel. What happened back there?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt? It all sounded so unbelievable, even to me. But I had to tell him. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. "It's the attic," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Something's..." Wrong with that attic, Ethan. There's a woman, her ghost. She's trapped there, but she's not alone. There's something else, something worse. He glanced at me, his brow furrowed. A ghost? Are you serious? I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but I saw her. She asked for help. And then there was something else. A shadow, something evil. I don't know what it is, but it's following us. It won't let us go. Ethan sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. You're under a lot of stress. You're probably just seeing things. Ghosts aren't real, okay? Whatever's happening, it's in your head. I thought that too, I said, my voice trembling. But it's not just me. That message on my phone, the one I showed you, it's real, Ethan. Someone or something is trying to warn us. He shook his head, exasperated. Look, I don't know what to tell you. I didn't see or hear anything at the house, and I didn't see anything at the motel either. Maybe it's just a bad dream. We've both been under a lot of pressure lately. I didn't respond. I wanted to believe him, to convince myself that this was all just in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was hard to keep track of time. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness thick and suffocating. The headlights cut through the gloom, but beyond that there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life, just the road and the shadows. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, the car was slowing down, and Ethan was pulling off to the side of the road. I blinked, groggy and disoriented, as the car came to a stop. Why are we stopping? I asked, my voice thick with sleep. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was staring out the windshield, his jaw clenched, his eyes wide and unblinking. Ethan? I reached out, touching his arm. He flinched, as if snapping out of a trance, and turned to look at me. His face was pale, his expression tense. Look, he whispered, pointing out the window. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty stretch of road illuminated by the headlights. But then, my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. Standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was her, the woman from the attic. Her pale face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and desperate, her long hair hanging in limp strands around her shoulders. She wore the same tattered dress I had seen her in before, its fabric blowing gently in the night breeze. She was standing perfectly still, watching us. Oh my God, I whispered, my heart racing. Ethan was frozen, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Do you see her? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my mouth dry. Yes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, staring at the ghostly figure on the side of the road. She didn't move either, didn't take a step toward us or raise a hand to signal for help. She simply stood there, watching, waiting. And then, without warning, she lifted her hand, pointing down the road. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. What is she? Before I could finish, Ethan slammed his foot on the gas and the car lurched forward, tires squealing as we sped down the road. I whipped around in my seat, looking back at the figure as we drove away, but she was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness. What the hell was that? Ethan muttered, his voice shaky. She was pointing, I said, my mind still reeling. Pointing at something up ahead. Ethan shook his head, his face pale. I don't care. I'm not stopping again. We drove in silence for a few more minutes, the tension thick between us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind us again, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out into the night. Suddenly a sharp turn came into view, and beyond it, the outline of an old house loomed in the distance. My stomach dropped as we approached, and I realized what the woman had been pointing at. It was the house. The same house we had fled earlier that night, the one with the cursed attic. We had somehow circled back to it. No, I whispered, my hands trembling. No, no, no. Ethan slowed the car to a stop at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the house in disbelief. How did we end up back here? I shook my head, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I don't know. We were driving in the opposite direction. This shouldn't be possible. But there it was, standing in front of us like some malevolent force, drawing us back into its grasp. The house looked even more foreboding than before, its windows dark and lifeless, the surrounding trees casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. "We can't go back in there," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, Ethan, let's just leave." Ethan hesitated, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We're not going back inside," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "We just need to figure out what's going on. Maybe there's a reason we ended up here again." Before I could protest, the phone in my lap buzzed, and I glanced down at the screen, dread pooling in my stomach. Another message had appeared. "He is waiting for you inside." The message on my phone made my heart skip a beat. "He is waiting for you inside." Ethan must have seen my face pale, because he glanced at me, his eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice unsteady. I didn't want to say it out loud. Speaking the words felt like acknowledging their power, like giving them life. But Ethan deserved to know. I handed him the phone, and he stared at the screen, his brow furrowing. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Then he cursed under his breath and threw the phone onto the dashboard, his hands gripping the steering wheel even tighter. "This is insane," he muttered. "I don't know who's messing with us, but I'm not playing their game." I nodded in agreement, though a part of me couldn't shake the fear that this wasn't a game at all. It felt far too real, too calculated. Whoever or whatever was behind this knew exactly what it was doing, and it wanted us back inside the house. The house loomed in front of us, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring into our souls. It was as if the very walls were calling us, beckoning us to return to the place where everything had started. Ethan shifted in his seat, the tension radiating off him. "We can't stay out here all night," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's just drive. There's no reason to go back." I nodded, hoping he'd put the car in gear and speed away. But just as he reached for the gear shift, the headlights flickered. At first, it was just a quick blink, a momentary disruption. But then, they went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "What the Ethan cursed, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but refused to start. He tried again and again, but the car wouldn't respond. It was dead. I stared ahead, my breath catching in my throat. The house was barely visible in the pale moonlight, but its silhouette was unmistakable. And somehow, in the eerie glow of the night, it seemed even closer than before. "We're trapped," I whispered. "No, we're not," Ethan snapped, though his voice was shaking. He grabbed his phone, lighting up the screen to cast a faint glow in the car. "I'll call for help. We'll get someone to tow us out of here." But as he dialed, a familiar feeling crept over me. The air grew colder and a chill ran down my spine. I knew, without needing to look, that something was watching us. I turned my head slowly, my gaze drifting toward the house. There, standing in the doorway, was the shadow. It was the same figure I'd seen in the attic, tall and imposing, its form nothing more than darkness in the shape of a man. It stood there, unmoving, but I could feel its eyes on me, like a predator waiting to pounce. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He's here." Ethan looked up from his phone, his face illuminated by the dim light. "What?" I pointed, my hand trembling. "In the doorway. He's watching us." Ethan followed my gaze, his expression hardening. "I don't see anything." But I knew he was there. I could feel him, as clearly as I had felt the cold breath on my neck back in the motel. He was waiting, just as the message had said. Ethan shook his head, frustrated. "We're leaving," he said, his tone firm. "Forget the car. We'll walk if we have to." He opened the door, and the moment he stepped outside, the temperature dropped even further. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle, fear gripping me. But I couldn't stay in the car alone, not with him so close. I forced myself to follow Ethan into the night, the icy wind biting at my skin. We stood in the driveway, the house towering over us. The trees around us swayed in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my gaze fixed on the doorway where the shadow had been. Except now, it was gone. I blinked, my heart pounding. "Where did he go?" I whispered. Ethan looked around, his expression tense. "There's no one here, okay? Let's just head for the main road and—" His words were cut off by the sound of the front door creaking open. Slowly, painfully, the heavy wooden door swung inward as if inviting us inside. My blood ran cold. The house was opening its doors to us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "I'm not going in there." Ethan grabbed my arm, his face pale but determined. "I don't like it either. But we don't have a choice. The car's dead, we're miles from anywhere, and my phone's not getting a signal. We can't just stand out here all night." I shook my head, my voice rising in panic. "There's something in there, Ethan. Something evil. If we go back inside, we'll never get out." He hesitated, his grip loosening. For a moment, I thought he might agree with me, but then his jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "I'll check it out. Just stay close to me." Before I could protest, he started toward the open door, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't let him go in there alone. So, against every instinct, I followed. The air inside the house was cold and stale, as if the place had been abandoned for decades. The faint scent of rot lingered in the air, mixing with the musty smell of old wood. Every floorboard creaked beneath our feet as we made our way through the entryway, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Ethan shone the flashlight around, revealing the familiar contours of the house. The faded wallpaper, the dust-covered furniture, the staircase leading up to the attic. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but somehow the atmosphere was different. More oppressive, more dangerous. "This place gives me the creeps," Ethan muttered, though his voice was low. "Let's check upstairs and then get out of here." I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the staircase, the very same one that led to the attic. The last time I had been up there, I'd seen the woman, begging for help, and the shadow. The thing that wanted me. Ethan moved ahead, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, and I followed, my heart racing with every step. As we reached the landing, I glanced toward the attic door at the end of the hall. It was closed, but I could feel something behind it, something waiting. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice tense. I strained to listen, my pulse pounding in my ears. At first there was only silence, but then faintly I heard it. A low whisper, barely audible, coming from the attic. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The whisper was too faint to make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was up there. Ethan glanced at me, his face pale. "We have to check it out." "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, Ethan, don't." But he was already moving toward the attic door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I watched in horror as he reached for the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was behind the door knew we were coming. Ethan turned the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing the narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. He shone the flashlight up the stairs, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the shadows. I stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe. I knew what was waiting up there, and I knew that if we went up those stairs, we would never come back. "Ethan, please," I begged, my voice barely audible. "Don't go up there." He hesitated, glancing back at me, but then the whispering grew louder, and his expression hardened. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. And before I could stop him, he disappeared up the stairs, into the attic. The moment Ethan disappeared into the attic, the air around me grew colder, more suffocating. My chest tightened, my legs felt like lead, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, paralyzed by fear, staring into the black maw of the attic. The whispering had stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything from Ethan. His footsteps, his voice, even the creak of a floorboard. But there was nothing. Only the hollow emptiness of the house around me. Seconds dragged on like hours. I wanted to scream his name, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, helpless, as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from above, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My stomach lurched, and I instinctively took a step back. "Ethan?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I forced myself to move closer to the stairs, my legs shaking with each step. I reached for the railing, gripping it so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I had to go up there. I had to find him. The whispering started again, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, dozens, maybe more, all murmuring in unison. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was insistent, urgent, as if they were trying to warn me. As I stepped onto the first stair, the door at the top of the staircase slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, gasping, and clutched the railing to keep from falling. The whispering stopped again, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't leave Ethan up there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. My body felt like it was moving through molasses, my limbs weighed down by dread. When I reached the top, I hesitated in front of the door. The air around me felt thick, suffused with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I could barely breathe. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob. The cold metal sent a jolt through my hand, but I didn't let go. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black. Ethan's flashlight lay on the floor, its beam flickering weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. But there was no sign of Ethan. "Ethan?" I called again, my voice barely a whisper. Still no answer. I stepped into the attic, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The floor creaked under my weight, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as I moved, as if they were alive. Suddenly I heard it, a soft, raspy breathing, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned, shining the flashlight in that direction, and froze. There, hunched in the shadows, was Ethan. His back was to me, his body unnaturally still. I couldn't see his face, but something about the way he was sitting, his shoulders slumped, his head hanging low, sent a wave of terror through me. "Ethan?" I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. He didn't move. I approached slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath me. When I was just a few feet away, I reached out a trembling hand to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed his skin, he jerked upright, his head snapping toward me. I stumbled back, choking on a scream as I finally saw his face. It wasn't Ethan. His eyes were wide, hollow, like empty sockets staring right through me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the shadow standing behind him, its long, skeletal fingers resting on his shoulders like a puppet master. The figure wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. It was a shape made of pure darkness, its form shifting and flickering as if it were barely tethered to this world. Its face, or what passed for a face, was nothing more than a void, an empty space where eyes, a mouth, or a nose should have been. And yet, I could feel it watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to move, locked in place by a terror so profound it felt as though my very soul was being sucked into the void. The shadow leaned in closer to Ethan, its fingers tightening around him, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "He belongs to me." The words echoed through the attic, reverberating off the walls, filling the air with a suffocating sense of finality. "No," I choked out, my voice hoarse. "No, he doesn't. Let him go." The shadow's empty face tilted, as if considering my words. For a moment, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent, as if the spirits trapped in the house were begging for release. Then, without warning, the figure began to dissolve, the darkness that formed its body unraveling like smoke. Ethan's body slumped forward, limp, as the shadow released its grip. I rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "Ethan! Ethan, wake up!" His eyelids fluttered, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was gone. But then, he drew in a ragged breath, his eyes slowly focusing on me. What happened?" he croaked, his voice weak and disoriented. I pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down my face. "You're okay, you're okay." We didn't waste any time. I helped him to his feet, and together we stumbled out of the attic, down the stairs, and out of the house. Neither of us looked back. When we reached the car, the headlights flickered back on, and the engine roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong. We didn't question it. Ethan drove, and I stared out the window, watching as the cursed house disappeared into the distance. We never spoke of what happened that night. Not to each other, not to anyone, but the memory lingered, a dark stain on our minds. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering. I can still feel the weight of the shadow's gaze, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that we may have left the house, but the darkness we encountered in that attic will never truly let us go. Story 2. I should have known something was off the moment I arrived at the house. It wasn't the eerie isolation of the location, tucked away deep in the woods, or the strange silence that hung in the air. No, it was the absence of him, our host, who had meticulously planned this weekend getaway. Miles Decker was never one to miss his own party, especially not one he'd boasted about for weeks. He had personally called each of us, raving about his newly inherited mansion, promising a gathering we'd never forget. But now, as I stood in front of the towering estate, watching the shadows lengthen over the driveway, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I wasn't the first to arrive. 3 cars were already parked along the gravel path, but there was no sign of Miles. No cheerful welcome, no hearty laugh echoing from the porch. I hesitated, clutching my bag. The house loomed large, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring back at me, daring me to step closer. Just as I was about to turn back and reconsider my weekend plans, I heard a voice calling from inside. "Ben, is that you?" It was Eva. Her voice carried an unusual tightness, but there was also relief in it, as if she was just as nervous as I was about the unsettling quiet. I took a breath and stepped inside the house, feeling the warmth of the hardwood floors beneath my shoes. The interior of the mansion was just as impressive as I'd imagined. High ceilings, vintage furniture, and intricate moldings running along the walls. It smelled of old wood and dust, like a place forgotten by time. Eva appeared from the grand living room, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She offered a quick smile, though her eyes darted nervously behind me, as if checking to see who else had arrived. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice trying to sound casual. "Miles must be around here somewhere. We've been waiting for him to show up." "Weird that he's not here to greet us," I said, scanning the room. "He was so excited about this weekend." Eva bit her lip, shrugging as if trying to downplay the strangeness. "I know, maybe he's just running late." I nodded, though the unease in her voice didn't help my own growing sense of dread. "Who else is here?" I asked, looking down the hall. The house felt disturbingly empty. "Rachel and Dan are upstairs, settling in. You know Miles, he likes to show up in his own time. He'll probably appear with some grand entrance any minute now." I chuckled, but it felt forced. "Yeah, that sounds like him." Eva nodded, and there was a moment of awkward silence. I couldn't help but glance toward the large staircase leading to the second floor. Something felt off. "I'm going to head upstairs, see if anyone's heard from him," I said, feeling like standing still in that eerie quiet was only making things worse. Eva nodded, her eyes following me. "Yeah, good idea. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." I made my way up the grand staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and I couldn't help but notice how the house, grand as it was, felt almost abandoned, as if it hadn't seen life in decades. The chill seemed to seep through the walls, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. When I reached the top, I found Rachel standing at the end of the hall, staring out the window. She didn't notice me approach at first, her focus entirely on something outside. Her usual energetic demeanor was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. "Rachel?" I called softly, and she jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Ben, God, you scared me," she breathed, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sorry about that. You okay? You seem a little off." Rachel hesitated, her gaze shifting back to the window. "It's nothing, just... this place gives me the creeps. I thought I saw someone out by the tree line, but when I looked again, they were gone." I glanced out the window, squinting at the thick line of trees that bordered the estate. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made it difficult to tell if anyone or anything was out there. "Probably just the wind playing tricks on you," I said, though I didn't fully believe my own words. "Yeah," she murmured. "Maybe." "Have you seen Miles?" I asked, changing the subject. She shook her head, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "No. I was starting to wonder if he's playing some kind of joke on us. You know how he likes to mess with people." I frowned. That would be typical of Miles, but something about this didn't feel like one of his usual pranks. "Dan around?" "Yeah, he's in the other room, unpacking." Rachel's voice was distant, her mind clearly still on whatever she thought she'd seen outside. "Weird, right? That he's not here." "Weird," I agreed. We lingered in the hallway a little longer, both of us unsettled by the growing darkness outside. When Rachel finally peeled herself away from the window, we decided to meet Dan and head downstairs together. But when we opened the door to the room where Dan was supposed to be unpacking, we found it empty. His suitcase lay open on the bed, his clothes half spilled out, but Dan was nowhere to be found. "Dan?" Rachel called, stepping further into the room. "Where are you?" No answer. The room was cold, the open window letting in a sharp breeze that made the curtains billow like ghosts. I stepped toward the window and peered outside. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift unnaturally, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. He wouldn't just leave without saying anything, would he? Rachel asked, her voice tinged with fear. I shook my head, my unease growing by the second. No, he wouldn't. As we stood there, staring into the growing night, the house around us seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath. And in that moment, I knew that something was terribly wrong. Miles was missing. And now so was Dan. Whatever this weekend had been planned to be, it was rapidly unraveling into something far darker. Rachel stood by the window, her face pale in the fading light. The breeze from the open window ruffled her hair, making her seem like part of the house, fragile and on edge. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread gnawing at the back of my mind, but it clung to me, tightening its grip. "I'll check downstairs again," I said, my voice low. "Maybe Dan went to find Eva or something." Rachel nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Neither was I. I moved toward the door, leaving her in the room as I descended the stairs. The creaks echoed like a whisper in the stillness, the sound sharp in the growing quiet of the house. The mansion, once grand and welcoming, felt more like a tomb. Eva was still in the kitchen when I found her, rummaging through one of the cabinets. She jumped when I entered, a look of relief crossing her face for just a moment before she asked, "Did you find him?" I shook my head, leaning against the doorway. "No sign of Dan. He was supposed to be unpacking, but he's just gone." Her expression darkened, a frown creasing her brow. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I mean gone," I said, the irritation creeping into my voice. "His stuff is there, his suitcase open, but he's not in the room. And Rachel said she thought she saw someone outside." Eva glanced over her shoulder toward the windows overlooking the darkening woods. Her face paled. "This isn't funny, Ben. If this is some kind of prank Miles is pulling, it's gone too far." "I don't think this is a prank," I muttered. "Something's not right." She crossed her arms, looking troubled. "Maybe we should call him, or call someone. I don't like this." I nodded, pulling out my phone, only to find that the screen was dark. I frowned, pressing the power button several times, but the device stayed unresponsive. "My phone's dead," I said. "It was fully charged this morning." Eva's face twisted into a look of confusion, and she quickly pulled out her own phone. I watched her thumb flick across the screen, her brows furrowing deeper. "Same here," she said softly. "It's not turning on." Just then, Rachel came down the stairs, her footsteps hurried. "Ben," she called, "I think we should leave. Something's wrong. Dan wouldn't just disappear without saying anything. We should get out of here now." I couldn't argue with her. The mansion felt like it was closing in on us. Every shadow seemed to be creeping closer. Every corner of the house filled with an unnerving stillness. "I'm with Rachel," I said, turning to Eva. "We should leave. We can figure this out later, but something's off, and I'm not staying here to find out what it is." Eva hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Let's go. We can drive back into town and try to get a signal there." We grabbed our things and made our way to the front door, the three of us moving quickly and without speaking. My nerves were on edge, and every step felt heavier as though something unseen was pushing against us. When we reached the front door, I turned the knob. It clicked and gave way easily, but when I tried to pull it open, it wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, but the door remained firmly in place. "It's stuck," I said, yanking at it again. "What the hell?" Eva rushed over to help, and together we pulled with all our strength. The door rattled in its frame but didn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. "Move," Rachel said, her voice tight with fear as she shoved her way forward. She grabbed the knob and twisted it frantically, pulling at the door as hard as she could, but it was no use. "Why won't it open?" I glanced toward the windows. "Maybe we can." A loud, echoing bang reverberated through the house, cutting me off. We all froze, staring up at the ceiling as the sound continued, thuds as if someone was moving something heavy across the floor upstairs. "Dan?" Eva whispered. I didn't answer. The noises grew louder, and soon they were accompanied by footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing the upper hallway. The sound was unmistakable, boots heavy against the old wooden floor. Rachel's eyes widened in terror. "No," she whispered, backing away from the stairs. "No, it can't be." "Stay here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I grabbed a fireplace poker from the hearth. Eva shook her head, grabbing my arm. "Ben, don't. We need to get out of here. We can break a window, find another way." "I just need to see who's upstairs," I insisted. "If it's Dan, or even Miles." I didn't wait for her response. With the poker gripped tightly in my hand, I moved slowly toward the stairs. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown, the thudding sounds above growing louder with every creak of the floor beneath my feet. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me like a dark tunnel. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. But I didn't. I had to see. I followed the sound of the footsteps, leading me to the same room where Dan had disappeared. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a rush of cold air hit me like a wall. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The footsteps had stopped. I stepped inside, gripping the poker like a lifeline. And then I saw it. In the center of the room stood a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a long, dark coat. His back was to me, his head slightly bowed, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, shallow and uneven. "Miles?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, my heart racing. "Dan, is that you?" Slowly, ever so slowly, the figure began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as the man faced me. It wasn't Dan. It wasn't Miles. The face that stared back at me was twisted and grotesque, half-rotted, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to see right through me. The skin hung loosely from its skull, blackened and decayed, as though it had been dead for years. My body locked in place, my mind screaming in panic, but I couldn't move. The figure smiled, a sickening, gaping smile that revealed rows of broken, jagged teeth. And then, in a voice that sent a cold shiver down my spine, it whispered, "You're next." I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The poker slipped from my hands, clattering loudly onto the floor. The grotesque figure took a step forward, its decayed face twisted into that eerie smile. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls seeming to shift and pulse in the dim moonlight. Then, I heard Rachel's voice from downstairs, but it felt distant, like a dream, disconnected from the immediate horror in front of me. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The figure moved toward me, each step deliberate, as if savoring the fear radiating off me. It made no sound, yet the air seemed to hum with its presence, a low vibration that reverberated in my chest. Just as it reached out a hand, those long, skeletal fingers clawed and blackened, I found the strength to move. I spun on my heel and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me as if that could stop it from following. The thud of my footsteps as I raced down the stairs echoed through the mansion, and I barely registered Eva and Rachel standing in the foyer, their faces pale with fear. "Ben, what happened?" Rachel cried, her voice trembling. "There's something up there," I gasped, my heart pounding so loudly I could hardly hear my own words. "Not Dan, not Miles, something else." Eva took a step back, glancing nervously toward the staircase. "We need to get out of this house, now." "No kidding," I said, my chest still heaving from the terror of what I'd seen. I grabbed the poker from where I'd dropped it on the stairs, gripping it tightly in my hand as if it could offer any real protection against whatever that thing was. Rachel rushed toward the nearest window and tried to open it. The latch clicked, but the window refused to budge. "It's stuck," she muttered in disbelief, pulling harder, but the window remained sealed shut. "It's like the house doesn't want us to leave," Eva whispered, her eyes wide. I moved to the front door again, yanking at the handle with all my strength. It rattled but stayed stubbornly closed, as if the very wood of the door had fused with the frame. Panic clawed at my chest. We were trapped. "We need to break one of these windows," I said. I thought, my voice shaking. It's our only way out. Eva didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the large bay window near the living room. The wood splintered on impact, but the glass didn't crack. Not even a scratch. "That's not possible," Rachel muttered, her voice tinged with panic. "It should have shattered." I exchanged a horrified glance with her. Something unnatural was happening here. Something beyond explanation. A deep, resonant thud echoed from upstairs, followed by another, and then a slow creaking, like old wood being strained under immense weight. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My grip tightened on the poker. "We need to stay together," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. What good would it do to stick together against something we couldn't understand, couldn't fight? We backed toward the center of the room, our eyes darting between the staircase and the windows, searching for any sign of movement. The air had grown colder, and a faint, rancid smell began to creep into the room, the smell of rot and decay. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our breathing. "Do you think it's gone?" Eva whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "No, it's waiting." For a moment, the three of us stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming weight of the unknown. And then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, we heard it, a low, rasping voice, faint but unmistakable. "Where are you?" The voice crawled up my spine, cold and malevolent. It wasn't just a question, it was a promise. It was hunting us. Rachel backed toward the kitchen, her hands trembling. "We need a plan. We can't just stay here and wait for it to find us." Eva nodded, her face pale. "Maybe there's another way out. A basement door, or something in the attic?" I didn't like the idea of going either direction. The attic seemed like a trap, and the basement, God knows what might be waiting for us down there. But the main level offered no safety either. We were cornered. "Let's check the basement first," I said. "It might have a back door or a window we can break." None of us liked the idea, but there was no other choice. We made our way through the house, moving quietly, trying not to make a sound. The door to the basement was at the far end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door that creaked loudly when I pushed it open. A wave of cold air hit us, and the smell of damp earth rose up from the darkness below. "Stay close," I whispered, leading the way down the narrow stairs. The air grew thicker as we descended, the shadows longer, stretching across the walls like dark fingers. My heart raced with each step, every creak of the wood beneath our feet amplifying the tension in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a large cavernous space filled with old furniture, dusty crates, and cobwebs that seemed to cover every inch of the room. It was colder down here, the temperature dropping noticeably the further we ventured. I scanned the room, searching for anything that might lead to an exit. There, at the far end, I spotted a heavy door. "There," I said, motioning for the others to follow. Eva hurried ahead, reaching for the door handle. She tugged, but it didn't budge. "Locked," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Break it open," Rachel urged, glancing nervously back toward the stairs. I raised the poker and slammed it against the door. The wood splintered but held firm. I swung again, harder this time, and a small crack appeared, the sound echoing in the hollow space. Suddenly, we heard a sound from behind us. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. We froze, and I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. At the bottom of the stairs stood the figure. It had followed us, its decayed face twisted into that same grotesque smile. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadows seemed to move and shift, taking shape. Figures, human-like, but distorted, their forms twisted and wrong. They lurched forward, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Oh my God," Eva breathed. "We need to get out of here," I said through gritted teeth, swinging the poker at the door again. This time, it cracked enough for me to wedge my fingers into the gap and pry it open. The door groaned as it gave way, revealing a dark tunnel on the other side. "Go! Now!" I shouted. Rachel and Eva didn't hesitate. They rushed through the opening, and I followed close behind, slamming the door shut behind us just as the figures reached the threshold. The door rattled as they pounded against it, but for now, it held. We were plunged into darkness. The only sound, the heavy thudding of our hearts and the distant, eerie scraping of the figures beyond the door. Where does this lead? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I admitted, but it's better than being out there with them. We pressed on, the tunnel stretching ahead into the unknown. The tunnel was a suffocating darkness, stretching on with no end in sight. Our footsteps echoed faintly off the stone walls, but the silence that followed was far worse. Every step forward felt like a descent deeper into the unknown, a place where logic no longer held sway, and fear became a living, breathing thing. I can't see anything, Rachel whispered. Her voice sounded brittle, on the edge of panic. Stay close, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though the truth was I had no idea where we were going. I was just as blind as she was. Eva's breath was shallow beside me, her hand occasionally brushing my arm to make sure we stayed together. The cold, damp air pressed in around us, and with every step, the smell of rot seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. It wasn't just the dampness of the tunnel. It was something older, something dead. Do you think those things can follow us? Eva asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of our steps. I glanced back, though I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness behind us. I don't know, I admitted, but if we keep moving, we might find a way out before they do. The tunnel curved ahead, the walls narrowing slightly, forcing us into a single file. The ceiling felt lower here, the air even more stifling, and my breath caught in my throat with every inhale. My hands brushed the damp stone as we moved, slick and cold against my skin, grounding me in the harsh reality of our situation. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. It was impossible to tell in the dark. Time had lost all meaning. Just when I thought the tunnel would never end, I saw a faint light ahead. A dim, flickering glow, like a candle struggling to stay lit. There, I whispered, pointing toward the light. Do you see it? Rachel squinted, nodding quickly. Yes, is it? Only one way to find out, I said, trying to inject a note of optimism into my voice. But the truth was, I didn't trust the light. Not in a place like this, not after everything we'd seen. Still, it was the only thing we had to go on. We moved toward the glow, our pace quickening, as the tunnel slowly widened again. The light grew brighter, flickering against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like figures on the edge of our vision. As we approached, the source of the light became clear. An old lantern, hanging from a rusty hook in the stone wall. Beneath it was a wooden door, slightly ajar, its surface scarred and weathered by time. I hesitated, glancing at Eva and Rachel. Do we go in? Rachel bit her lip, her eyes flickering nervously toward the door. Do we have a choice? I pushed the door open gently, wincing as the old hinges groaned in protest. The room beyond was small, cramped, and lined with shelves stacked with dusty books and jars filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. In the center was an old wooden table, and on it lay a single large tome, its cover blackened with age. It's a study? Eva said, her voice tinged with confusion. It didn't make sense. Who would have a study down here? And why? I stepped cautiously into the room, my eyes drawn to the book on the table. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Look at this, Rachel said, pointing to the far wall. There, etched into the stone, were symbols, intricate and sharp, spiraling out from a central point. They glowed faintly in the dim light, as if pulsing with an energy of their own. What is this place? Eva whispered. I don't know, I replied, moving toward the symbols. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, yet somehow they felt familiar, like something out of a nightmare I'd forgotten. Rachel approached the table, her eyes fixed on the tome. What do you think this is? She asked, her hand hovering over the cover as though she was afraid to touch it. Don't, I warned, but it was too late. Her fingers brushed the surface, and the room seemed to shift. The light from the lantern flickered wildly, the shadows on the walls stretching and twisting into unnatural shapes. A low hum filled the air, growing louder by the second, and the symbols on the wall began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Rachel pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with horror. What did I do? The hum turned into a roar, and the floor beneath us began to tremble. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the very room was coming alive around us. We need to get out of here, I shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her toward the door. But just as we reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing us inside. Eva rushed forward, yanking at the handle. It won't open. The roar grew louder, the symbols on the walls glowing with an intense, blinding light. The ground shook violently, knocking us off our feet. Books tumbled from the shelves, jars shattered on the floor, spilling their strange contents across the room. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The shaking ceased, the light faded, and the room fell into an eerie silence once more. For a moment, none of us moved, too stunned to speak. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the same fear reflected in Rachel and Eva's faces. "What just happened?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer, but before I could say anything, the room grew cold. Deathly cold. The kind of cold that sank into your bones and made your skin crawl. And then, from the far corner of the room, came a sound. A soft, rasping breath. We all turned toward the sound at once. In the corner where the shadows were deepest, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, barely noticeable. But then it stepped into the faint light of the lantern, a figure, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow and black. It was the same figure I had seen upstairs, but this time it wasn't smiling. It moved slowly toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and with every step it took, the symbols on the walls began to glow again, pulsing in time with the soft rasp of its breath. "Stay back," I warned, raising the poker in front of me. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its hollow eyes fixed on us, empty and cold. Eva backed against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. There was no escape. The door was sealed, and the figure was closing in, its skeletal fingers outstretched. And then, just as it reached the center of the room, it stopped. For a moment, the air was still, the only sound the faint flickering of the lantern's flame. And then the figure spoke. "I've waited so long." Its voice was like sandpaper, rough and broken, but there was something else in it, something that made my blood run cold. "You will not leave." The figure's rasping voice hung in the air, each word like the scrape of nails on stone. Its hollow eyes bore into us, and for a moment it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My grip on the poker tightened, though I knew it would be useless. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was considering the question, its grotesque face a mask of twisted malice. "You cannot leave," it said again, the words slow, deliberate, as though spoken from deep within its decayed throat. Behind me, Rachel stifled a sob, her hands trembling as she pressed her back against the wall. Eva's eyes were wide with fear, darting between the figure and the sealed door, as if willing an escape to materialize. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep the terror out of my voice. "What are you?" The figure took a step closer, and the cold in the room intensified, so much so that I could see our breath in the air. Its skeletal hand reached out, stopping just short of my chest. The smell of decay and death overwhelmed my senses, making it hard to breathe. "I was here, before you," it rasped, "before them all." Its words sent a chill down my spine. "Them all?" I echoed. "Who do you mean?" The figure's hollow eyes seemed to flicker with something, pain maybe, or anger. "The ones who came before. The ones who stayed and were taken." Taken. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what it was saying. Were there others before us, trapped in this house? The missing host, Dan, Miles, and maybe more we didn't even know about. Why us? Eva's voice was shaky, barely holding together. "What did we do?" The figure's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment I thought it might attack. But instead it spoke again, its voice softer, but no less terrifying. "You entered, and now you cannot leave. You are part of this place." "This place?" I repeated, glancing around the room, my eyes landing on the strange symbols that lined the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light of the lantern. "What is this place? What do these symbols mean?" The figure didn't answer, but its gaze lingered on the symbols, as if drawn to them. Slowly, it raised its other hand, pointing toward the wall where the symbols spiraled outward from a central point. "The mark binds us all," it whispered. "It cannot be broken." I took a step closer to the wall, the symbols pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. "These marks, did they trap you here too? Is that why you can't leave?" The figure didn't respond immediately, but its hollow eyes seemed to darken, a deep sadness settling over its twisted features. "We are bound," it rasped, "forever." I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Whatever force had trapped this creature, this thing here, had claimed more than just it, and now it had us too. "We need to find a way out," Rachel said, her voice shaky but determined. "There has to be something that can break this." The figure took a step back, retreating into the shadows, its form flickering as if it were fading from existence. "There is no escape," it whispered, its voice growing fainter. "But you will try," as they did. And with that, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, none of us moved, too shocked by what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Eva whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still racing. "But whatever it is, it's not going to let us go easily." Rachel stood up, her back still pressed against the wall, her face pale but determined. "We can't just sit here and wait to die," she said. "We need to figure out what those symbols mean, and if they can help us get out of here." I nodded, moving toward the wall, my eyes scanning the intricate patterns. The symbols were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but there was a strange familiarity to them, as if I had seen them somewhere before. "These marks," I said, running my fingers along the carved lines. "They must have something to do with the curse on this place. Maybe if we can figure out what they mean, we can break it." "But how?" Eva asked, her voice trembling. "We don't know anything about this kind of stuff. We're just normal people." "I don't know," I admitted, "but we don't have much of a choice." Rachel joined me, her eyes fixed on the symbols. "Maybe the book," she said suddenly, her gaze shifting to the large tome still lying on the table. "It might have something in it. Maybe it can tell us what these marks mean." I hesitated, remembering what had happened the last time Rachel had touched the book. But she was right. We needed answers, and the book might be our only hope. With a deep breath, I reached for the tome, my fingers brushing the cracked leather cover. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the book itself was pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. "I don't like this," Eva muttered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Neither do I replied, but I opened the book anyway. The pages were old and brittle, filled with handwritten symbols and drawings that mirrored the ones on the wall. The text was written in a language I didn't recognize, the letters sharp and angular, but something about them tugged at the edge of my memory. This is some kind of ritual," Rachel whispered, leaning over my shoulder to look at the pages. "Look, here." She pointed to a diagram on one of the pages, a large spiral surrounded by symbols identical to the ones on the wall. "This is the mark," she said, her voice filled with both dread and fascination. "It's the curse. It's what's keeping us here." "But how do we break it?" Eva asked, her voice strained. Rachel's eyes scanned the page, her brow furrowed. "I don't know," she admitted, "but there has to be a way. If this book can explain how to create the curse, maybe it can tell us how to destroy it." I turned the pages carefully, searching for anything that might give us a clue. The drawings grew more disturbing as I went, depicting figures in agony, twisted and bound by the same symbols that lined the walls of the room. The further I read, the more I realized just how old and dangerous this curse was. And then toward the back of the book, I found something. A passage written in red ink, the letters larger and more jagged than the rest. It looked like a warning. "This might be it," I said, my finger tracing the words. "It says something about a way to undo the binding, but it's unclear." Rachel leaned in closer, squinting at the text. "It's in the same language, but here, this word, it means sacrifice." Eva paled. "Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't know. It just says that a sacrifice is required to break the binding." The room seemed to grow colder at her words, the silence thick and oppressive. None of us wanted to say it, but the implication was clear. To break the curse, something or someone would have to be given up. The word sacrifice lingered in the air like a death sentence, and a thick silence descended upon the room. We stood there, each of us processing what the book was implying, our minds racing to grasp the reality of the situation. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut. A sacrifice, Rachel muttered again, barely audible. But what does that mean exactly? Do we have to give up something? Or... She trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging in the air. Eva's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. You don't mean someone has to die? I didn't want to believe it either, but the grim tone of the ancient writing and the malevolent energy in the room told me otherwise. Maybe it doesn't have to be that, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Maybe it's something symbolic, a sacrifice of something else, something we value. Rachel frowned, glancing back at the book. But if it is something like that, the text would have said more, right? This seems intentional. Whoever wrote this knew what they were doing. The chill of the room seeped into my bones, and I could feel the pressure of our predicament closing in. We need to figure out what this means, and fast. If there's a way out, we'll find it, but we have to stay focused. Eva backed away from the table, her voice tight with fear. I don't know if I can do this. I don't want to be trapped here forever, but I can't. I won't. She didn't finish, but we all knew what she meant. None of us could fathom the idea of turning on each other just to escape. Rachel stepped closer, her face set with determination, but there was a tremor in her voice. Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to keep reading, figure out exactly what the sacrifice entails. We don't know for sure what it means yet. I nodded, trying to suppress the growing dread inside me. Right? We'll find another way. We have to. I turned back to the book, flipping through the pages with increasing urgency. The cryptic symbols and twisted drawings offered little comfort, but there had to be something. Some clue hidden in the text that could tell us what to do without resorting to the unthinkable. Rachel's eyes flicked between the pages, her brow furrowed. Here, she said, tapping a section of the text that had been written in a different hand, more hurried, more desperate. This looks like someone added it later. It's almost like a warning. I leaned in to read, the words difficult to make out through the faded ink and jagged scrawl. The binding is eternal. Once invoked, the host becomes the sacrifice. The mark cannot be removed without payment. To unbind the mark, the host must give that which it values most. The host. I murmured, the word hanging heavily in the air. Is that Dan? Rachel shook her head. I don't think so. I think it's us. Eva's breath hitched. But we're not the ones who created this. We're just guests. How could we be hosts? Because we entered the house, Rachel said, her voice grave. And we triggered the curse. Now we're bound to it. The enormity of it crashed down on me. We weren't just trapped here. We were part of the curse now, entangled in whatever ancient ritual had been set in motion by forces far beyond our understanding. And if the passage was right, the only way to break free was to offer up something of immense value. Maybe there's something else, I said, flipping desperately through the pages. Some way we can cheat the system. There has to be. But deep down, I knew there was no easy way out. The symbols on the wall, the ominous warnings, the figures' haunting words, all of it pointed to one conclusion. The house demanded a price. Rachel stood silently beside me, her face pale but resolute. If the house requires a sacrifice, we need to figure out what it values most before it decides for us. Eva shook her head, backing further into the corner. No, I can't do this. We can't sacrifice anyone. I'm not saying we should, Rachel said quickly, holding up her hands, but we need to know what we're dealing with. Maybe we can trick it, I suggested. Give it something symbolic, something that doesn't cost a life. Rachel bit her lip, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for an answer hidden in the walls. What if it's not just a person? What if it's something else, like a memory or a part of ourselves? The book says what we value most. That doesn't have to mean death. Eva looked between us, her face still tight with fear. But what if it does? Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted again. The lantern on the wall flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the shelves. A deep, oppressive cold swept through the room, and with it, the unmistakable sound of rasping breaths. It was back. We all turned toward the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. The figure emerged once more, its gaunt form barely visible in the dim light, but its presence overwhelming. The stench of decay filled the air, thick and nauseating. You have seen the truth, it rasped, its voice low and broken. "Now you must decide." Its hollow eyes fixated on us, as if waiting for our answer. Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "What kind of sacrifice does the house want?" The figure didn't move, but its voice seemed to fill the room. "That which you hold most dear will set you free." Eva whimpered. Her body pressed against the wall, as if she could will herself to disappear. "This isn't fair. We didn't do anything. We just wanted a place to stay." The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of its bones creaking like ancient wood. "The house does not care what you wanted, only what you are willing to give." The cold in the room grew unbearable, every breath feeling like ice in my lungs. My mind raced, trying to find a solution, an escape, anything that didn't involve the horrifying choice we were being forced to make. "There has to be another way," I said, my voice shaking. "We'll give up something, anything, but not a life." The figure's hollow gaze turned to me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like pity in its expression. But then its voice cut through the air, as sharp as the cold around us. "There is no escape without loss." Rachel's face tightened with determination. "We're not going to let this place take us. We'll find a way." But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. The weight of the house, the curse, the ancient ritual, it was all pressing down on us, and time was running out. The figure began to retreat into the shadows once more, its final words echoing in the freezing air. "Decide, or the house will decide for you." And then it was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. The room felt darker and colder after the figure vanished, its last words hanging over us like an executioner's blade. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, my mind spiraling in disbelief. How had we gotten here? What kind of nightmare had we walked into? Eva's soft sobs broke the silence, her hands covering her face as she slid down the wall. "We're going to die in here," she whimpered. "I don't want to die." I crouched down next to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, though I had no comforting words to offer. None of us had any answers. We were being toyed with by a force far beyond our understanding. "We're not going to die," Rachel said, though the waver in her voice betrayed her fear. "We're going to figure this out. There has to be something in that book, or maybe something in the house. We just need to keep looking." I stood up, feeling the weight of the house bearing down on us. Every creak, every flicker of shadow felt alive with malevolence, as if the house was listening to us, waiting for its next move. "I don't know how much time we have," I said, my voice low. "The house, it's not going to wait forever. The longer we're here, the more it's feeding on us." Rachel's eyes flicked toward me, her expression unreadable. "Then we need to decide." "Decide what?" Eva snapped, wiping tears from her face. "Whether we let this place kill one of us?" "No," Rachel replied firmly. "I refuse to believe that's the only option. The house wants us to think that, but there has to be something else. Maybe it's testing us, seeing how far we'll go." "Testing us?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "You think this is some kind of game?" "Not a game," she said, shaking her head. "A ritual. It's feeding off our fear, our desperation. But if we stay calm, if we think this through, maybe we can beat it." Eva let out a shaky breath, her eyes still wide with terror. "And if we can't?" The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive. None of us wanted to answer that question. "I'll keep looking through the book," Rachel finally said, picking it up again. "There has to be something we missed. Maybe there's a way to reverse the binding without sacrificing anyone." She sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as us, but at this point, it was all we had. I nodded, trying to push down the gnawing sense of hopelessness rising in my chest. If we were going to survive this, we needed to stay together. Rachel began flipping through the brittle pages of the tome again, her eyes scanning the cryptic text and symbols. I moved over to the wall, running my fingers along the cold stone, hoping for some hidden clue, some crack in the house's armor. But the house wasn't going to make this easy for us. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something odd. A faint outline on the floor near the far corner of the room. I knelt down, brushing aside the dust and grime, revealing a small, trapdoor-like panel embedded in the floor. "Guys," I called, my voice hoarse. "There's something here." Rachel and Eva rushed over, their faces pale as they crouched beside me. I dug my fingers into the edges of the panel and lifted it slowly, revealing a set of narrow, spiraling stairs leading down into the darkness. "What is that?" Eva asked, her voice trembling. "A way out?" Rachel suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I peered down into the abyss below. The staircase was old and worn, and the air that wafted up from the darkness was damp and musty, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. "This doesn't feel like an escape route," I said quietly. "It feels like the house is leading us somewhere." Rachel's jaw clenched. "Maybe it is, but we don't have a choice. We need to know what's down there." Eva shook her head vehemently. "No way, I'm not going down there. What if it's a trap? What if it's worse than what's up here?" Rachel stood, staring down into the darkness with grim determination. "What if it's the only way to break the curse?" I exchanged a glance with Eva. None of us wanted to go, but something about the hidden staircase felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle we were trying to solve. If the house was trying to lead us somewhere, maybe it was also giving us a chance, however slim, to end this nightmare. "I'll go first," I said, steeling myself. "But we need to stick together. If this is the house's game, we need to be ready for anything." Rachel nodded, and though Eva was clearly terrified, she gave a shaky nod as well. With one last deep breath, I descended into the unknown, the creaking stairs groaning under my weight as I plunged deeper into the cold, damp darkness. The walls were close, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic like old blood. The stairs spiraled down for what felt like an eternity, and with every step, I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on us, its malevolent presence growing stronger. Whatever waited for us below, it wasn't going to be easy. Finally, the staircase opened up into a narrow stone passageway, the walls slick with moisture. The only light came from the flickering lanterns we carried, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the damp stone. "This place," Rachel murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's old, older than the house above." Eva clutched her lantern tightly, her wide eyes darting around the passage as if expecting something to leap from the darkness at any moment. "What is this place? A basement?" "More than that," I said, my voice hollow. "It's a tomb." As we moved deeper into the passage, I noticed carvings along the walls, symbols similar to the ones in the room above, but older, more primitive. The further we went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with the weight of centuries. And then we reached it. At the end of the passage was a large circular chamber. The walls were lined with bones, stacked neatly in rows, their hollow eye sockets staring down at us. In the center of the room was a stone altar, worn with age and stained with dark, dried blood. Eva gasped, covering her mouth as she backed away. "Oh my God!" Rachel stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where the sacrifices were made." I moved closer to the altar, my skin crawling as I looked down at the dark stains that covered the stone. The smell of death was overpowering, and I felt bile rising in my throat. But there, carved into the surface of the altar, were the same symbols we had seen before. "This is where the curse started," Rachel said, her voice low and filled with dread. "This is where they sacrificed people to bind the house." Eva whimpered, backing away further. "We need to leave. We shouldn't be here." But something on the altar caught my eye. A small, rusted dagger, its blade twisted and dull, but unmistakably sharp enough to kill. It was positioned perfectly in the center of the altar, as if waiting for someone to use it. "No," I muttered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The sacrifice isn't just symbolic, it's real. Rachel looked at the dagger, her face ashen. "It wants us to kill someone. That's what the curse demands." Eva's breathing became ragged, her eyes wild with fear. No, I can't do this. I'm not going to kill anyone." "We're not killing anyone," I said firmly, though the words felt hollow. "There has to be another way." But even as I said it, I knew the truth. The house wasn't going to let us go without a price, and if we didn't make a choice soon, it was going to make one for us. The oppressive silence of the bone-lined chamber was suffocating. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blood-stained altar and the dagger lying in its center. It was as if the house had orchestrated everything to bring us to this moment, this choice. "We have to think," Rachel said, her voice strained but determined. She backed away from the altar, her eyes never leaving the twisted dagger. "There must be something else we can do. Maybe we don't need to use it." Maybe just being here is enough to break the curse. Eva shook her head frantically. No, it's not enough. The house wants something. It's not going to let us go without taking it. Her voice broke on the last word, and I could see her trembling. She was right. Every step of the way, the house had been leading us, cornering us. Now we stood at the precipice, and there was no turning back. I stepped closer to Rachel, my voice low. We can't just assume. We need to figure out exactly what the curse demands, or we could end up making it worse. Rachel shot me a look, a mixture of fear and frustration in her eyes. You think I don't know that? But what other choice do we have? The sound of her voice echoed unnervingly off the chamber's stone walls, causing Eva to flinch. I glanced around the room, trying to make sense of the symbols etched into the bones, the eerie arrangement of the remains. There was something ritualistic about the whole setup, but nothing we hadn't already encountered. Then my gaze fell on the far wall. It was different. Deeper carvings, almost fresher, if that was possible in a place like this. Rachel, I said, moving toward the wall. Look at this. She followed me, and Eva hesitantly stepped closer, though she kept a wide berth from the altar. The symbols were similar to those in the book, but these seemed more deliberate, more instructive. Rachel ran her fingers along the jagged lines. It's the same language, but I can't make all of it out. We need the book, I said. It might help us figure out what this means. Rachel nodded and hurried back up the stone staircase, the flicker of her lantern disappearing into the darkness as she retrieved the ancient tome. Eva and I stayed behind, watching the carvings in silence. Do you think this will work? Eva asked softly, her voice barely audible in the cold, damp air. Do you think we can really get out of here? I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I didn't want to lie to her, but I didn't want to crush whatever hope she had left. I don't know, I admitted, but we have to try. We can't let this place win. Before she could respond, Rachel returned, the heavy book clutched in her arms. She laid it open on the stone floor, flipping through the pages with quick, practiced motions. The flickering light of our lanterns made the ancient text seem even more otherworldly, casting long shadows over the brittle pages. Rachel traced her fingers over the symbols on the wall and compared them to the text. It's some kind of instruction. This is where they conducted the ritual, the sacrifices. But this part, she pointed to a specific section. It's different. It talks about a choice, something about free will. A choice? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. What kind of choice? Rachel frowned, squinting at the faded words. It's hard to make out, but it seems like if the sacrifice is made willingly, it breaks the curse. But if it's forced, the curse continues, stronger. Eva's breath hitched. So someone has to volunteer? Rachel nodded grimly. That's what it looks like. The house isn't just demanding a sacrifice. It wants someone to choose it. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The house wasn't going to let us off easy. It wasn't just about killing, it was about surrendering, about giving yourself willingly to whatever ancient power was woven into its walls. We need to keep looking, I said, my mind racing. There has to be another option. What about those other symbols? The ones that talked about unbinding the mark? Rachel's eyes scanned the walls again. It's connected. The binding is only broken if the sacrifice is willing. If we don't choose, the house will keep us here forever, or worse. Eva's hands flew to her face. Oh God, this can't be happening. This can't be real. My stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't the horror story any of us had expected. We were trapped in something far older and darker than any ghost or haunting. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive and it thrived on suffering. We still don't know if it has to be a person, I said, grasping at straws. Maybe it's something else. What if it's a part of ourselves, like you said earlier, Rachel? A memory, a possession, something we hold dear. Rachel turned to me, her face shadowed with doubt. Do you really believe that? I didn't. But what other hope did we have? We don't know for sure, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. But we have to try. We can't just kill someone. We're not murderers. Rachel looked down at the book, her jaw clenched in thought. Maybe you're right. Maybe the house is trying to manipulate us into thinking that's the only way. Eva shook her head. I don't want to die here. I don't want any of us to die. Then we keep looking, I said, taking a deep breath. We keep reading, we keep searching. There has to be something else we're missing. But as the hours dragged on, and we combed through the book and scoured the chamber for any other clues, the oppressive weight of the house began to press down on us harder. There was no hidden passage, no secret incantation. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The house demanded a sacrifice, one freely given. I could feel the walls closing in, the cold seeping deeper into my bones. Time was slipping away from us, and with each passing moment the house grew hungrier. "We need to decide," Rachel said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Eva was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes wide and vacant. She had shut down completely. Rachel looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "If we don't do something soon, the house will choose for us." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "You know there isn't. The house wants us to choose. If we wait too long, it's going to take one of us, and we won't have any control over who." I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The thought of making that kind of choice, of choosing someone to die, was unbearable. But the alternative was even worse. If we didn't choose, the house would, and we would all be trapped here forever, or worse. Rachel's eyes locked on mine, pleading, "We have to do something." I looked at the altar, at the twisted dagger that lay waiting. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of us. My mind raced, but every thought led back to the same, horrifying conclusion. Someone had to die, and we had to decide who. The air in the chamber felt electric, crackling with unspoken dread as we all stood at the brink of an unspeakable choice. My mind raced, grasping for a way out of this nightmare. Every option felt like a trap, and I could see the flickering shadows closing in around us, eager to consume our fear. "We can't just decide," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What if there's a way to escape without making that choice? We have to search the book for something. Anything." Rachel's eyes were wild, her breath quickening. "We've gone through it so many times already. It's all about the sacrifice. It wants us to choose." "Then we have to find a way to break that," I insisted. "Maybe if we can uncover the original binding." Eva interrupted, her voice rising in desperation. "You don't get it. The house is playing with us. It's only giving us these false choices to feed off our fear. It doesn't matter if we try to escape. It will always lead us back to the dagger." I looked at Eva, feeling my heart ache for her. She was scared, but I couldn't let that fear overwhelm us. "We can't give up. If we do, it wins." The silence grew thick as we stood there, the gravity of our predicament weighing heavily upon us. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting to the altar. "What if," she started, her voice trembling, "what if we offered a part of ourselves instead?" "What do you mean?" Eva asked, her brow furrowing. "Not a physical sacrifice," Rachel clarified, "but something that represents us. A memory, a possession, something that holds meaning. If the house is feeding off our fear, maybe it can be tricked into believing it has what it wants without killing anyone." It was a wild idea, but desperation had made us all reckless. "It's worth a shot," I said, nodding slowly. "We don't have many options left." Eva looked between us, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "But what if it doesn't work? What if it just makes everything worse?" "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," I replied firmly. "But right now, it's our best chance." Rachel stepped back toward the altar, her expression resolute. "We each need to choose something, something that symbolizes our will to live, our refusal to let the house take us. It might be just enough to confuse whatever is binding us." I took a deep breath, trying to focus. I had always found comfort in my childhood toys, especially a small weathered teddy bear I had kept for years. It represented safety, a part of me I couldn't let go of. "I know what I'll use," I murmured, glancing back toward the staircase. "I'll get it." As I ascended the spiral staircase, my heart raced. The house loomed around me, its walls whispering secrets, taunting my resolve. I hurried to my room, grabbing the teddy bear from its shelf. The worn fabric and familiar scent brought a wave of nostalgia. But I knew this was about survival. When I returned to the chamber, Eva and Rachel were deep in thought, searching for their own symbolic sacrifices. Eva held up a delicate silver necklace, her fingers trembling around it. "This was my grandmother's," she said softly, her voice breaking. "It's all I have left of her. Rachel had removed a simple bracelet from her wrist, her expression solemn. "This was given to me by my father. It means everything to me. I'll use it." With our 3 items gathered, we formed a circle around the altar. The air grew thicker, the walls pressing in around us as if the house were watching, waiting. "Together," Rachel said, her voice steady, "we offer these to the house. We refuse to play its game, and we refuse to give in to fear." I felt the weight of her words sink into my bones, and I nodded, raising my teddy bear above my head. "We offer these as symbols of our will to live, to fight against this curse." Eva followed suit, her necklace shining dimly in the flickering light. Rachel held her bracelet high, determination radiating from her eyes. As we chanted the words Rachel had deciphered from the book, "We are not bound, we are not sacrificed. We choose to live, and we stand united." I felt a surge of energy in the room, the atmosphere shifting as if the house itself were responding to our defiance. The dagger on the altar trembled, vibrating softly as a gust of cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing our lanterns. Darkness enveloped us, and a low rumble echoed from the walls, vibrating through the stones like a heartbeat. "Stay together," I shouted into the void, reaching out to grab Eva's arm and Rachel's shoulder. "We can't lose each other." In the darkness, I could feel the presence of the house, a malevolent force pressing against us, suffocating and hungry. But we held our ground, the warmth of our connection grounding us against the chilling fear. Suddenly, a bright light exploded in the chamber, illuminating everything around us. The symbols on the walls glowed with an ethereal brilliance, and the dagger was lifted from the altar, hovering in the air before us. A booming voice filled the space, a deep rumble that resonated with power. "You dare challenge the binding? You dare defy the choice?" I clenched my fists, fear surging through me, but I stood firm. "We are not bound by your rules. We choose our own path, and we will not sacrifice one of our own." The light flickered, and the house trembled as if shaken by my declaration. "The binding is strong," the voice thundered, echoing through the chamber. "You cannot escape it." Rachel stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "But we can choose how to break it. We will not let fear guide us. We will sacrifice these tokens of our past instead of our lives." The dagger began to pulse with energy, the light intensifying. I could feel the weight of the house's anger, the fury swirling around us. But we held on to each other, our unity grounding us. "You think these trinkets will appease the binding?" The voice sneered, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. "It demands blood." "Not ours," I shouted back, my voice rising above the cacophony. "We refuse to let you take what you want. We stand together." With that, the dagger shattered into shards of light, scattering across the chamber. The glow intensified, engulfing us in warmth and radiance, as the house roared in fury. For a moment, everything went still. Then the walls began to crack, the stones splintering under the pressure of our defiance. The very foundation of the house shook, and I felt the ground beneath us start to shift. "We're doing it," Rachel cried, her eyes alight with hope. "Keep going, keep fighting." As the light surged, the chamber began to collapse, the bones rattling and shaking free from the walls. I felt a rush of exhilaration. Maybe we could do this. Maybe we could escape. But even as I thought that, the floor beneath us buckled, sending us tumbling to the ground. I reached out, desperately grabbing for Rachel and Eva, as the chamber fell apart around us. "Get up!" I shouted, forcing myself to my feet. "We have to get out of here." The walls groaned and cracked, the sounds echoing like a death knell as we scrambled toward the stairs. We could hear the howls of the house, the fury of the entity that had kept us trapped for so long. As we reached the spiral staircase, I glanced back. The chamber was collapsing, dark shadows swirling in the light, threatening to consume everything. "Run!" I yelled, and we sprinted up the stairs, the sound of crumbling stone and swirling wind pushing us forward. Finally, we burst through the trapdoor, falling onto the cold floor of the room above. Panting, we scrambled to our feet, the oppressive atmosphere of the house still swirling around us, but with a different energy, a sense of chaos and uncertainty. "Is it over?" Eva gasped, her face pale but filled with hope. "I don't know," I said, looking around, "but we need to leave. Now." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "We have to find a way out before it reasserts its hold." Together, we hurried toward the door, every instinct screaming at us to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. As we pushed through the door, the sound of furious howling echoed behind us, the house protesting our escape. "Run!" I shouted, and we raced down the hall, our footsteps echoing through the darkened corridors. The air was heavy, thick with fear and uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of hope. We had defied the house. We had made a choice. Whatever happened next, we had to stick together and find a way out. But as we turned the corner, the hallway shifted, the walls pulsating with energy. I could feel the house fighting against us, trying to reclaim its hold. "No, we won't go back," Rachel shouted, pushing against the air as if it were a solid barrier. I felt the ground tremble beneath us, a low growl emanating from the very walls. The house was alive, and it was angry. "We have to find a window," Eva shouted, her voice strained. "An opening. Anything." But just as we reached what looked like a window frame, the walls shifted, closing it off and sealing us in darkness once more. The hallway closed in around us, the shadows thickening like a living entity, swirling and pressing against our skin. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to push forward, leading Rachel and Eva toward what I hoped was the exit. The house wasn't going to let us go easily, but we had one thing we hadn't before: unity. "Don't stop," I shouted, feeling the vibrations of the house rumbling through my feet. The air buzzed with electricity, and I could almost hear the screams of past souls trapped within its walls, echoes of lives lost to this nightmare. Rachel gripped my arm tightly, her knuckles white. "We have to keep going. We're so close." A sudden gust of wind blew through the corridor, icy and sharp, knocking us off our feet. The floor beneath us shifted, and the hallway itself seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, twisting like a serpent. I scrambled up, heart pounding, pulling Eva to her feet. "Look!" Eva pointed frantically to our right. A flicker of moonlight glimmered through a crack in the wall, casting a thin, silvery line down the dark corridor. "That's our way out," I gasped. With renewed determination, we stumbled toward the light, each step feeling like wading through quicksand as the house fought to drag us back. The whispers in the walls rose to a crescendo, a chorus of angry voices echoing our fears and doubts. "Come back," the voices hissed. "You belong to us." "No," Rachel shouted back, her voice steady, cutting through the noise. "We don't belong to you. We never did." The moonlight grew brighter as we approached the crack, and I could feel the cool touch of the night air. We were almost there. The closer we got, the more the house shuddered, and I could hear the sound of timber cracking, the very foundation groaning in protest. Eva reached the wall first and slammed her fists against it, widening the crack. I joined her, and together we pried the wood apart until it splintered, revealing the dark expanse of the night sky beyond. The air smelled of damp earth and freedom. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Eva through the gap. She stumbled and fell into the grass outside, scrambling to her knees. Rachel followed, squeezing through with a cry as the wall splintered and closed behind her, catching the hem of her shirt and tearing it. I turned back to the shadows, swirling around me, the house screaming in rage as it tried to reclaim its prize, but I wouldn't let it. With a final burst of strength, I leaped through the opening, feeling the icy tendrils of the house clawing at my legs, but they couldn't hold me. I hit the ground outside, the cool, damp grass cushioning my fall. The roar of the house reached a fever pitch behind us, and I turned just in time to see the structure begin to collapse in on itself. The roof caved inward, the walls buckled, and the windows shattered, spewing glass into the night. It was as if the house were being consumed by an invisible force, devoured by its own dark magic. Rachel reached out and grabbed my hand, her grip tight. We watched as the house folded in on itself, the screams fading into the wind until there was nothing left but the broken remains of its foundation and an eerie silence that settled over the clearing. We sat there in stunned silence, our chests heaving with exertion, eyes wide and disbelieving. The nightmare was over. The house was gone. Eva's voice broke the silence, weak but resolute. "We did it. We're free." I nodded, unable to speak as relief washed over me. The three of us clung to each other, a circle of warmth in the cold night, bound by the knowledge that we had faced something no one else could truly understand, and survived. In the days that followed, the clearing where the house had once stood became a place marked by whispers, a ghost story passed around by locals but never truly believed. But we knew the truth. We had faced the darkness, defied the curse, and broken free. And as we walked away from that place for the final time, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger than before. The house, with its ancient hunger and dark secrets, would never claim another soul. Not while we still had the strength to fight. Story 3. The room was nothing special at first glance. The wallpaper, once cream-colored, was now faded and peeling, giving way to the old wooden panels underneath. A single window allowed a shaft of muted light to filter in, casting elongated shadows across the dusty floor. It was the kind of room that might have belonged in a forgotten wing of an old manor, tucked away from prying eyes. But there was one detail that defied ordinary explanation. The door. A thick, mahogany door with no visible lock or handle, perfectly smooth and seamless as if carved from a single piece. It stood closed, indifferent to the world outside it, and no matter how hard I tried, it refused to budge. I sat back on my heels, wiping sweat from my brow as I surveyed the room again. I had come here on a dare, a foolish bet made at a gathering where the stories of the old estate's mysteries ran rampant. The locals called it the room that listens, and no one, they claimed, had entered it in years without feeling the weight of unseen eyes. A chill trickled down my spine as I stood and walked to the window. The estate grounds stretched out below me, bathed in the cold glow of the moon. The wind rustled the leaves of the skeletal trees, and the sound seemed to whisper my name. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the cold that had settled deep within me. "Get a hold of yourself," I muttered. The air in the room seemed to press in on me, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the silence that was unsettling, it was the feeling that the silence was alive, that the room itself was waiting for something. I turned back to the door and pressed my ear against it, listening for any noise from the hallway. Silence. Tentatively, I knocked, the sound echoing dully. Still nothing. Hours passed. The moon's light shifted across the floor, dragging shadows with it. Every attempt I made to force the door open proved futile. The room was sealed, and no amount of pushing, pounding, or even prying at the edges yielded any result. An uneasy thought crossed my mind. What if the stories were true? What if this room held secrets meant to stay hidden? The air grew colder, and the faintest whisper drifted past my ear. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper sent shivers down my spine, my heart thundering in my chest. I spun around, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any trace of another presence. But the room remained as it was, silent, unmoving, and chillingly indifferent. I backed away from the center, pressing myself into the corner where the walls met, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. The house was old, drafty. Perhaps the voice was just the wind winding through a crack I hadn't noticed. Yet deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. "Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and thin, swallowed by the vast silence of the room. The seconds dragged on without a response, but the atmosphere felt charged as though something had shifted, some line had been crossed. The window rattled in its frame, and I could feel the pulse of the room quicken, matching the erratic thud of my heart. Suddenly, there was a sound. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a tapping, rhythmic and precise. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the direction of the door. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to take a step closer. Each tap resonated within me, a summons impossible to ignore. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, urging me toward the sound. I reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the cool surface of the door. It was absurd, I thought, trying to reason with myself. Just an old door, just an old room. But as I touched the wood, the tapping stopped. Silence fell like a hammer, pressing into my ears and filling my head. Before I could withdraw my hand, a voice whispered again, clearer this time, and more insistent. "Let me out." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the floor. Pain shot through my hip, but it was nothing compared to the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around my chest. The room watched me, its shadows lengthening as if alive, quivering at the edges. I pushed myself up, crawling backward until I hit the wall. The door remained closed, as solid as ever, but there was no denying what I had heard. "Let me out," the voice had said, almost pleading. The stories rushed back to me in vivid detail. Tales of the manor's previous owner, a man named Elias Thornton, who had disappeared one night, never to be seen again. They said he was eccentric, obsessed with locking himself away in this very room for days on end. Some believed he had gone mad. Others whispered that he had been taken by something inhuman. I shook my head, trying to dispel the suffocating weight of the past pressing down on me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel sweat trickle down the back of my neck despite the chill. The voice didn't return, but the silence was worse, filled with potential, pregnant with dread. I needed to get out of here. I stood and approached the window, hoping to signal someone, anyone outside for help. But when I looked out, the grounds that had once seemed vast and sprawling now looked different. A dense fog had rolled in, swallowing the trees and shrouding the estate in a ghostly blanket. The world outside was gone, replaced by a sea of white. The door creaked behind me, the groan of wood shifting under pressure. I spun around, eyes wide, heart leaping into my throat. The door was moving, not swinging open, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, bending outward as if pushed from the other side. "Please," the voice whispered again, and this time it carried a note of desperation that made my skin crawl. "Let me out." I could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into me, could sense the thrum of energy that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Whatever was behind that door wasn't human. But in that moment, as the air thickened and the shadows crept closer, I wasn't sure that mattered. A choice loomed before me: confront the voice, or find another way to escape. My pulse raced as the creaking of the door deepened, the wooden surface bowing outward like a great beast trying to break through. I inched closer to the window, hands searching desperately for any weakness in the glass or frame. If I could just break it, climb out into the swirling fog, anything would be better than facing whatever was behind that door. The voice called out once more, this time louder, clearer, and tinged with pain. "Please, let me out. I don't want to be alone anymore." The plaintive tone made me hesitate, a flicker of doubt piercing through my terror. I glanced back at the door. It wasn't just moving anymore. It was shuddering, trembling as if something was pounding on the other side with all its might. A thin crack split down the center, and from that fracture seeped a cold, inky darkness that pooled like smoke. My body tensed, instinct screaming at me to run. But the voice, it sounded so human, so familiar. There was a vulnerability there that made my heart ache with recognition, though I couldn't place why. "No," I shook my head, trying to clear it. I can't do this." I whispered to myself, but my feet were rooted in place. The room seemed to pulse, and for a moment I thought I could hear the thrum of a heartbeat that wasn't my own, low and resonant, shaking the walls around me. The darkness that oozed from the cracks slithered forward, inching across the floor like an insidious shadow, reaching for me. "I'm here. I've always been here." The voice took on a pleading note, as if on the verge of tears. The pounding on the door intensified, a chorus of thuds that reverberated in my bones. I took a step back, my mind warring between horror and curiosity. What if whatever was in there was trapped, forgotten, desperate to be saved? The thought made me sick with uncertainty. Could I risk it? Could I face whatever entity had been locked away for so long? Before I could answer, the crack in the door widened, and the smoky darkness surged forward, curling around my ankles like living vines. The cold seared into my skin, freezing me in place as a face began to press out from behind the wood, its features blurred and shifting as though struggling to form. "Let me out," it whispered again, the voice now almost gentle, coaxing. "I need you." The room spun, my vision blurring as fear collided with an inexplicable pull, a strange connection that felt like déjà vu. Memories that weren't mine flared up. Moments of standing in this room, looking out at the moonlight, feeling trapped and hopeless. But those weren't my memories. They belonged to someone else. "Elias," I breathed, the name slipping from my lips unbidden. The pounding stopped, the silence so sudden and complete that I staggered. The face in the door grew clearer, its eyes, pale, haunted, met mine, and I felt a jolt of recognition as if looking into a mirror. "Yes," the voice said, soft now, almost reverent. "It's me." The smoky tendrils tightened their hold, pulling me closer to the door, drawing me toward the crack that widened like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Panic surged, and I fought against the pull, my arms flailing for something to hold on to. "No!" I screamed, kicking against the cold grasp, my body thrashing with renewed desperation. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy, the walls groaning as if they would cave in at any moment. Just as my strength was waning, a sudden surge of warmth bloomed inside me, a light that pushed back against the darkness. I gasped, feeling the grip on my legs weaken, the smoky tendrils recoiling as if burned. "Leave me!" I shouted, the voice not just mine but layered, as if someone else spoke through me. The smoky form in the door let out a guttural wail, the sound laced with fury and anguish. The crack in the wood snapped shut, and the darkness evaporated into the air, leaving only the room and the door, silent and still once more. I stumbled back, chest heaving, as the first rays of dawn pierced through the window. The room brightened with the light of the new day, and the oppressive weight lifted as if it had never been there at all. I turned to the door, no longer shuddering, no longer bowed. It stood quiet, just a door, unmoving. Whatever force had tried to breach the barrier was gone. With a trembling hand, I reached for the window latch, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on my skin. I forced it open, the glass yielding easily now. The fresh morning air rushed in, filling the room with the scent of dew and freedom. I climbed through and fell to the soft earth outside. As I looked back at the window, a shadow moved behind the glass. A face watching with eyes so familiar, so haunted. It was gone in an instant, replaced by nothing but the stillness of the old, locked room. And though the stories of the house would linger, whispered from person to person, I knew one thing for certain. I would never return. I lay in the damp grass, feeling the cold seeping through my clothes, grounding me in reality. The morning sun cast a warm glow across the landscape, burning away the mist that had swallowed the estate just hours before. My breath came in short gasps, each one carrying the remnants of the terror I had faced inside that room. Slowly I sat up, my gaze drawn back to the window. The glass glinted innocently in the early light, as if mocking me, daring me to question what I had seen. But I knew better. Whatever had spoken to me, whatever had reached through that door, had been real. And it was gone now, or so I desperately wanted to believe. The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faintest trace of something metallic. I shuddered, brushing the feeling away and forcing myself to stand. My legs felt weak, my entire body trembling as though I had run for miles. But I was outside, under the open sky, and for now that was enough. The estate loomed behind me, a skeleton of its former grandeur, draped in shadow despite the sun's rise. Memories of the night clawed at the edges of my mind. The voice, the face pressing out from behind the door, and the way it had called to me, drawing me in with a familiarity I couldn't explain. "Elias," I whispered again, the name still foreign yet weighted with meaning. Who had he been, and why had I felt as though we were connected? The thought gnawed at me, but exhaustion and the pounding ache in my head kept the questions at bay. I turned away from the house, taking one last glance over my shoulder. The window remained empty, no shadow or face watching me this time. The silence felt different now, less ominous, more resigned. It was as though whatever force had lived in that room had returned to its rest, and with it, the estate breathed a sigh of relief. I stumbled down the overgrown path that led to the main gates, the thorns and weeds tugging at my clothes like grasping fingers. The path was longer than I remembered, winding through clusters of trees that reached for the sky. The sounds of birds calling to each other began to filter through the air, a welcome reminder that life existed beyond the confines of that cursed room. As I reached the iron gates, rusted and coated in ivy, I paused to catch my breath. Beyond them, the road that would lead me back to the village waited, promising safety and familiarity. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened in that room wouldn't stay there. The connection between me and Elias, the way his voice had echoed in my ears, it felt like the beginning of something, not the end. A soft wind brushed against my face, carrying with it a whisper so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." I spun around, heart lurching, but the estate stood silent, its secrets buried once more. The sun shone brighter, burning away the last of the morning mist, and casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows, a flicker of something dark, a silhouette. But when I blinked, it was gone. I turned away, pushing open the gate and stepping onto the road. The morning stretched before me, full of light and noise and the promise of safety. But as I walked, I knew I would never forget the night I spent in the locked room, nor the voice that had called out from the darkness. And deep down, a part of me wondered if Elias Thornton had truly been freed, or if he was simply waiting for the day he would return. As I walked down the gravel path, the village's familiar rooftops came into view, their chimneys spouting thin tendrils of smoke that curled into the brightening sky. The sun's rays began to warm my chilled skin, and with each step, the thudding of my heart slowly settled into a calmer rhythm. But the whisper I had heard at the gate clung to me like a shadow, an echo that refused to fade. "Thank you." The words replayed in my mind, and with them came the memory of Elias's face pressing out from the door, eyes wide with something between desperation and hope. Had he truly been set free, or had I done something much worse by stepping into that room? The village square was beginning to stir as I approached. Early risers carried baskets of goods, chatted in low voices, and swept the cobblestones clean. The sight and sounds of normal life brought a rush of relief that made my knees weak. I paused, leaning against a stone wall, and tried to steady my breathing. "Liam?" A voice called, laced with concern. I turned to see Eliza, the village innkeeper's daughter, standing with a basket of apples balanced on her hip. Her eyes were wide, taking in my disheveled appearance. "Where have you been? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words stuck in my throat, tangled in fear and confusion. What could I say? That I had spent the night locked in a room that shouldn't exist, speaking to a ghost who shared my voice? I got lost in the woods, I managed, avoiding her searching gaze. The explanation was flimsy, and her expression told me she didn't believe it, but she nodded slowly. "Come, sit down. You need some water and rest," she said, her tone firm as she guided me toward a nearby bench. The townsfolk cast curious glances as I passed, their whispers brushing my ears like the rustle of dry leaves. They had always spoken of the old manor with dread, but now I felt the weight of their stories in a way I never had before. Eliza set her basket down and handed me a canteen. I drank greedily, the cool water soothing my parched throat. The tremors in my hands began to subside, but the sensation of Elias's presence lingered, like the memory of an unfinished conversation. "Eliza," I said after a moment, my voice low, "have you ever heard of Elias Thornton?" Her brow furrowed, and she sat beside me, the bench creaking under our combined weight. "Only in the stories my father used to tell. They say he was the last master of the manor before it fell into ruin. Some claim he went mad, others say he vanished without a trace." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated. Telling her the truth felt like tempting fate, like inviting whatever dark force dwelled in that room to reach beyond its confines. But if anyone would understand, it might be her. Eliza had always been fascinated by the stories, digging through old records and asking questions others avoided. "I think I saw him," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. "Saw him? In the manor?" The question hung heavy in the air, and I could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. She looked around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear, and then leaned in. "Liam, no one stepped foot in that place in years. You shouldn't have gone there." "I know," I said, running a hand through my hair. "But I did, and there's something inside that room, something that knows me. I don't know how, but it does." Eliza's expression shifted from fear to determination. She stood and grabbed my arm. "Come with me. There's someone we need to talk to." I let her pull me to my feet, my body protesting with every step. We made our way through the narrow streets until we reached the far side of the village, where the stone cottages gave way to an old, ivy-covered chapel. Inside, the scent of dust and old wood filled my nose, and the morning light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the floor in muted hues. Father Wilkes, the village priest, stood near the altar, his back to us as he sorted through a stack of ancient-looking books. He turned at the sound of our footsteps, his lined face softening when he saw Eliza, but hardening slightly as his gaze settled on me. "Eliza, Liam," he greeted with a nod, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. "What brings you here so early?" "We need to know about Elias Thornton and the manor," Eliza said without preamble. Father Wilkes's eyes darkened, and he set the book in his hand down with deliberate care. "Why now?" His voice was grave, almost accusatory. I swallowed hard, the weight of the room pressing down on me again. "Because he's still there," I said, the confession tasting like iron on my tongue. "And I think I let him out." Father Wilkes's eyes widened, and for a moment the chapel was deathly silent. The beams of colored light from the stained glass windows seemed to dim, casting shadows that flickered like restless spirits. The priest stepped closer, his expression shifting from disbelief to something far more urgent. "Eliza," he said sharply, "bolt the door." Eliza nodded, rushing to secure the chapel's heavy wooden entrance. The clunk of the iron latch echoed through the space, and a shiver ran down my spine. Father Wilkes turned back to me, his voice a mix of anger and concern. "Liam, tell me everything. Leave nothing out." I swallowed, my throat dry and tight as I recounted the night at the manor. I told him about the room, the tapping, the voice that called out to me, and the face that pressed from behind the seamless door. I spoke of the moment I felt the strange connection, the familiarity of Elias's name on my lips, and finally, the whisper at the gate. "Thank you." The priest's face grew pale, the lines on his brow deepening as I spoke. He crossed himself absently, eyes darting to a tattered Bible resting on the altar. "You've done something few would dare, Liam," Father Wilkes said, voice low. "Elias Thornton's disappearance was never truly explained. The stories say he was consumed by his own obsession with that room, but some whispered of darker things, entities that called to him, promising knowledge, power, freedom. They say he tried to seal them away, but in doing so, he sealed himself as well." Eliza took a shaky breath, and now Liam's let him out. I looked between the two of them, dread settling in my stomach like lead. "What does that mean for me? For us?" Father Wilkes hesitated, the weight of his thoughts clear in his furrowed brow. "If Elias's spirit has been released, then it is likely searching for something. Peace, perhaps, or vengeance. But if what you saw was not just Elias but something else..." He stopped, his eyes flickering to the stained glass window, where the image of St. Michael wielded a sword against shadowed figures seemed to shift in the changing light. "What?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "Then we may be dealing with more than just a spirit. The darkness that consumed him might not be content to stay bound to that room. If you felt a connection to Elias, it might mean that whatever bound him there is now tied to you." The air in the chapel thickened, the creaks of the old wood sounding like whispers. A sudden chill passed through the room, making the candles flicker. Eliza crossed her arms, eyes wide and uncertain. "There must be something we can do to stop it." Father Wilkes nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. We need to find out why the room called to Liam in the first place. And if Elias spoke to him, then there might be hope." "Hope?" I repeated, not sure if I dared to believe it. The priest took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto mine with a resolve that both terrified and steadied me. "We must return to the manor," he said, "and this time we must confront what lies within." The words settled over us like a dark promise, and despite the sunlight filtering through the stained glass, I felt the chill of night creeping back in. The silence that followed Father Wilkes's declaration seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I looked at Eliza, whose face had paled further, her hands gripping the edge of the pew until her knuckles were white. The fear was mirrored in my own racing heart, but beneath it, a strange determination sparked. I had started this, whatever it was, and I couldn't abandon it now. "When?" I asked, the question pushing through the tightness in my chest. "When do we go back?" Father Wilkes's expression hardened, the set of his jaw speaking of a resolve born from years of faith and struggle. "Tonight," he said. "We must go when the veil between this world and the next is at its thinnest. If there is a chance to speak with Elias and understand what he wants, we need to take it." Eliza's eyes met mine, wide and questioning, searching for reassurance that I couldn't give, but she nodded, swallowing back her fear. "Then we prepare now. We'll need lanterns, salt, and anything else you think could help." Father Wilkes moved with a sudden urgency, shuffling through his books and pulling out a worn leather tome with faded writing on the cover. He placed it on the altar and opened it to a page covered in symbols and careful notes written in the margins. "We'll need protection," he said, tracing the lines with a gnarled finger. "Symbols of warding and prayer." I watched him, my breath catching as the reality of what we were about to do settled over me like a heavy cloak. The manor, with its dark history and the shadowy being behind that door, was no longer just a place of whispers and ghost stories. It had become a battleground, and I was tied to it in ways I couldn't fully understand. The hours until nightfall passed in a haze of preparation. Father Wilkes sketched symbols on parchment and handed us each an amulet blessed with prayers. Eliza gathered supplies, her hands shaking only when she thought no one was looking. I busied myself cleaning the lanterns, their glass panes smudged and worn. Every movement felt mechanical, the reality pressing harder with each tick of the old chapel's clock. Dusk crept over the village, painting the stone cottages in deep hues of purple and blue. By the time the sun sank below the horizon, the three of us stood at the edge of the woods, the manor silhouetted against the sky like a sentinel. The path leading to its doors was shrouded in shadow, the underbrush crackling beneath our hesitant steps. The closer we got, the colder the air became, leaching the warmth from my skin and making my breath cloud before me. The manor loomed larger, the windows dark and unreadable. A faint breeze stirred, whispering through the trees like a warning. Father Wilkes led the way, his lantern casting a pool of light that seemed too small against the vastness of the night. He muttered prayers under his breath, the words barely audible over the crunch of gravel. Eliza followed close behind, clutching her own lantern, the flame flickering as though it too were afraid. We stepped through the threshold of the manor, the door groaning as if in protest. The silence inside was suffocating, heavier than before, and it wrapped around us like a shroud. Every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet seemed to echo through the halls, an unspoken challenge to whatever lingered there. "The room is up ahead," I said, my voice hoarse. I led them down the corridor, each step pulling me closer to the memory of Elias's voice and the dark tendrils that had reached for me. The door was just as I'd left it, standing closed, deceptively ordinary. Father Wilkes stepped forward, pressing a palm against the wooden surface as he closed his eyes. The silence hummed, charged and expectant. "This is where the barrier is thinnest," he whispered. He opened his eyes and looked at me. "Liam, whatever happens, do not break the circle." He turned to Eliza, who nodded and handed him the jar of salt. With deliberate care, he poured it in a circle around us, the granules gleaming white in the flickering light. When he was done, he began to chant, his voice low and commanding. The room seemed to shift, the shadows lengthening, dancing along the walls like wraiths. A cold wind swept through the corridor, rattling the windows and making the flame in my lantern sputter. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the handle tighter, my knuckles aching. Then the voice came again. "Liam." It was soft, familiar, and laced with sorrow. The temperature dropped further, and a figure began to coalesce in the air before us, ghostly and translucent. Elias. His eyes, haunted and tired, met mine, and I felt the strange pull again, a bond that transcended time and reason. "Why did you come back?" His voice trembled, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "We came to help," I said, the words quivering in the cold air. "To understand." His gaze shifted to Father Wilkes and Eliza, then back to me. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's not me you should fear." Before we could react, the door behind Elias splintered, a dark, swirling void erupting from its center, tendrils of shadow clawing outward. The figure of Elias twisted, his expression contorting in pain as the darkness reached for him and us alike. "Eliza, hold the circle," Father Wilkes shouted, his voice ringing with urgency as he raised his amulet. The shadows recoiled, hissing, but only for a moment. "We need to end this now." Father Wilkes thrust the amulet forward, chanting louder, his voice gaining strength with each word. The dark tendrils that had erupted from the splintered door writhed, recoiling slightly but refusing to withdraw. The room vibrated with an unnatural hum, the air thick with an energy that felt alive and predatory. Elias's spectral form flickered, his face contorted with pain as the shadows anchored themselves to him like chains. "You must break the connection," he shouted, his voice echoing as if it came from a great distance. His eyes found mine, pleading, "Do not let it take you." I glanced at Eliza, her face pale, eyes wide with fear but set with determination as she maintained the circle. The flame in her lantern trembled wildly, casting frantic shadows that leaped across the walls. Father Wilkes continued his chant, sweat beading on his brow as the amulet in his hands glowed with a faint, wavering light. The dark tendrils suddenly surged forward, lashing out at the circle. One struck the barrier of salt, sizzling as if seared by flame, and the acrid scent of smoke filled the room. But the barrier held, if only just. "Liam, help me hold them back." Eliza's voice shook but held firm. I nodded, my body moving on instinct as I reached for the canister of salt, reinforcing the line where it had begun to thin. Elias's figure began to fade, the anguish in his eyes deepening. "It feeds on the connection," he rasped. "Sever it, Liam, or it will consume us all." The words hit me with a cold realization. The bond between us, forged when I first answered his call, was not just a link, it was a channel. The entity had latched onto me as a conduit, using it to escape its prison. "Father, how do I break it?" My voice cracked with urgency, my hands trembling as I sprinkled more salt. The tendrils clawed against the barrier, shrieking with rage. "You must renounce it, Liam. Cast it away with every part of your being," Father Wilkes shouted, eyes locked on the writhing darkness. The light of his amulet flared, momentarily driving the shadows back. "Deny its hold over you." I clenched my jaw, closing my eyes and drawing a deep breath. The connection pulsed within me, like a second heartbeat, heavy and cold. I could feel the entity's presence, coiled around it, leeching power from the bond that tied me to Elias. "I sever this bond," I whispered, the words tasting of iron and fear. I forced them louder, stronger. "I reject you. You have no power over me." The room quaked, the shadows recoiling with a keening wail. Pain lanced through my chest, sharp and sudden, as if something was being torn from me. I fell to my knees, the lantern slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, its light spilling across the stones. The tendrils faltered, their grip on Elias weakening. He looked at me, relief mingled with sorrow as his form brightened, becoming more solid, more human. The darkness around him shrank back, swirling like storm clouds before vanishing into the void of the shattered door. "Thank you," Elias whispered, his voice faint but free of pain. He cast one last look at me, eyes softening with a peace I hadn't seen before. Then, with a final shudder, his figure dissolved into a fine mist that drifted upward and disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing. The shattered door, now nothing more than splinters and ash, lay motionless. The oppressive chill lifted, replaced by a warmth that seeped into my bones. Father Wilkes sank to a pew, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. Eliza dropped beside me, her hand gripping mine, both of us shaking but alive. "It's over," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I looked up at the fractured remains of the room, feeling the weight that had anchored itself to me finally lift. Elias was free, the darkness vanquished, for now. But the memory of his voice, the way he had looked at me, stayed. I knew I would carry it with me, a reminder that some battles are fought in silence, behind doors only few dare to open. The quiet that filled the manor after the battle was almost surreal, as if the house itself were taking a breath for the first time in years. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. I sat there, knees on the cold, cracked floor, Eliza's hand wrapped tightly around mine. Our breathing slowly evened out, each exhale releasing a bit more of the tension that had gripped our bodies. Father Wilkes pushed himself to his feet, using the edge of a pew for support. His amulet, now dull and ordinary looking, dangled from his hand. He surveyed the room with a weary eye, the remnants of the dark presence, now just soot stains on the walls and scattered splinters of wood. "We need to bless this place," he said, his voice raspy but steady, "and seal it so nothing like this can happen again." His gaze met mine, and for the first time since we'd entered the manor, he smiled, a small, tired smile that carried the weight of what we'd just survived. "You did well, Liam, better than anyone could have asked." I tried to return the smile, but my face felt numb. The bond that had connected me to Elias was truly severed, and with it went the haunting sense of familiarity, replaced by a hollow ache. I nodded, looking down at the torn floorboards where the door had once stood. There was nothing left of it, no sign that it had ever been more than ordinary wood and iron. Eliza squeezed my hand again, drawing my attention. Her eyes were full of unshed tears, but she managed a grin, shaky and relieved. "We'll make sure no one has to go through this again," she said, the conviction in her voice sparking a warmth in my chest. "Agreed," I said, finding my voice. It was hoarse, but it felt like mine again, untouched by whatever darkness had whispered to me through the night. We gathered what was left of our supplies and made our way out of the manor. The night air met us like a balm, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of leaves and damp earth. Above, the sky was beginning to lighten, streaks of soft pink and blue heralding the dawn. I glanced back at the manor one last time, its shadowed windows and cracked stone walls no longer as menacing, but still steeped in memory. Father Wilkes turned to face it, raising his arms and reciting a blessing that flowed like music on the breeze. The words wrapped around the manor, soaking into its very stones, until the place seemed to exhale one final time, a deep release that marked the end of its restless torment. We stood in silence for a long moment, watching as the first rays of sunlight kissed the rooftops of the village below. It felt like waking up from a long, terrible dream. One that, despite everything, we had survived. The walk back to the village was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached the outskirts, the townsfolk were beginning to stir, their faces lighting up with curiosity and concern as they caught sight of us. Word would spread quickly, stories would be told and retold, but the truth of what happened within those walls would remain ours. As we parted ways, Father Wilkes placed a hand on my shoulder. His eyes, though tired, were steady and kind. "Take heart, Liam. What we did tonight will be remembered, even if only in silence. You faced something most would run from, and you won." Eliza hugged me, a tight embrace that spoke of gratitude and friendship that would not be shaken. "We'll be all right," she whispered, "together." I nodded, watching as they both walked toward their homes, lanterns bobbing gently with each step. The village began to hum with the sound of morning life, birds singing, the creak of doors opening, and the soft murmur of voices. It was a new day, and it felt like a gift. I turned back once, looking at the silhouette of the manor on the hill. It stood silent, no longer a place of dark secrets, but one that now held a story of release, sacrifice, and courage. Elias's face lingered in my mind, no longer twisted in pain but softened in a peace I hoped was real. As I made my way home, the weight of the night lifted, replaced by the simple promise of the morning sun. Whatever darkness had once held me, I was free, and I knew that as long as there were people willing to fight against the shadows, hope would endure. Story 4. I arrived at the edge of Ashcroft Hollow, just as the last traces of daylight slipped beneath the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, a reminder of the recent rain that had swept through the region. As I drove down the narrow, winding road leading to the Willow's Rest Inn, the towering trees on either side seemed to lean closer, their branches intertwining like fingers trying to grasp at the fleeting light. The inn stood at the heart of the town, a relic of the past, nestled among crooked streets and buildings that whispered of another century. Its facade, though once grand, now bore the weary look of a place touched by time and secrets. The sign above the entrance swung gently in the evening breeze, creaking with a sound that seemed almost sentient. "The Willow's Rest," it read, the letters faded but still legible, etched into wood that had weathered many storms. As I parked my car and stepped out, the chill in the air bit at my skin, urging me to pull my jacket tighter. The inn loomed before me, its dark windows reflecting the last light of day like unblinking eyes. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had made the right choice to escape the chaos of the city for this remote sanctuary. But as a travel writer, I often found inspiration in the quiet corners of the world, and something about the Willow's Rest beckoned me. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, casting long, wavering shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The cozy decor, complete with mismatched furniture and thick rugs, created an inviting atmosphere that made me feel oddly at home. A bell sat on the front desk, gleaming dully in the half-light. I rang it, the sound piercing the quiet, and after a moment, footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond. An elderly woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile appeared, her hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap. "Welcome to the Willow's Rest," she said, her voice a soothing melody. "My name is Mrs. Hawthorne. You must be Mr. Turner?" I nodded, setting down my suitcase. "Thank you. I hope I'm not too late." "Not at all, dear. We're delighted to have you." Her eyes glimmered as if with some hidden knowledge, but she turned briskly, beckoning me to follow. "Let me show you to your room." I trailed her up the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath our weight. The air grew cooler as we ascended, carrying with it the scent of old cedar and something else, something metallic. At the end of the hallway, she pushed open a door, revealing a small room with a single window that overlooked the darkened street below. "Make yourself at home," she said. Her voice dropped to a whisper, almost too soft to hear. "And if you hear knocking in the night, don't answer." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, leaving me in the silence that thickened like a fog. I set my suitcase on the bed, a simple frame draped in a patchwork quilt. The room felt oddly comforting, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I moved to the window and peered out, but the street was empty, the only movement coming from the wind rustling through the leaves. As night settled over Ashcroft Hollow, I decided to unpack my belongings and settle in. The quaint charm of the inn began to envelop me, drawing me into its embrace. I opened my suitcase and placed my clothes in the old wooden dresser, its surface worn smooth by years of use. The faint smell of lavender wafted from a sachet tucked into the drawers, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace. After I finished unpacking, curiosity tugged at me. I ventured out into the hallway, eager to explore the inn. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, echoing through the quiet space. The walls were adorned with photographs of past guests, their faces frozen in time, each one telling the story of a visit long forgotten. I made my way down to the common room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. A few guests were gathered, their voices a soft murmur that blended with the crackling flames. An elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, sat in a corner, wrapped in blankets as they sipped steaming mugs of tea. Across the room, a woman in her 30s sat alone, her dark hair falling over her face as she scribbled in a notebook. "Hello," I said, approaching the couple. "Is this a good place to stay?" "Oh, it's charming," Mrs. Bennet replied, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "We come here every autumn. It's peaceful and perfect for reflection." Mr. Bennet nodded, adding, "Just make sure to mind the stories. This place has a few ghosts of its own." I laughed, trying to dismiss the chill that ran down my spine. "Ghosts? You're joking." Mrs. Bennet exchanged a glance with her husband before turning back to me. "Not joking at all. You'll hear the stories if you listen closely. Many have stayed here over the years, and some never checked out." The woman at the table glanced up, her interest piqued. "You'll find the history of this inn fascinating," she said, her voice smooth yet distant. "I'm Clara, by the way." "Alex," I replied, intrigued. Clara had an air of mystery about her, her eyes darting around as if she were searching for something or someone. "Just be careful what you dig into," she added, her gaze turning serious. "Not all stories have happy endings." A shiver raced down my spine, but I shrugged it off as just the chill of the evening air. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. After some time, I excused myself and returned to my room, eager to shake off the unsettling feeling. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the stories swirling in my mind. Mrs. Hawthorne's warning echoed in my thoughts, mixing with the warnings of the Bennets and Clara. Sleep came slowly, each creak of the inn and whisper of the wind pulling me deeper into an uneasy slumber. The night passed in fits and starts, my dreams a kaleidoscope of shadows and echoes. I found myself wandering through darkened hallways, searching for something just out of reach. The sense of foreboding grew, wrapping around me like a shroud. When I finally drifted into a deeper sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud thump from the hallway. Heart racing, I sat up and strained to listen. Silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant sound of the wind outside. Moments stretched into eternity, and I fought the urge to check the time. Instead, I lay back down, forcing myself to breathe deeply. But just as I began to relax, another sound echoed through the hall. Soft knocking, rhythmic and persistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I remembered Mrs. Hawthorne's words. If you hear knocking in the night, don't answer. But curiosity burned within me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cool floor sending a shiver up my spine. I tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it. The knocking continued, but now it was accompanied by a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. My mind raced. Was it Clara? Had she come back? The knocking grew louder, a frantic rhythm that compelled me to open the door. With a trembling hand, I grasped the doorknob and turned it slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was dark, shadows swirling in the corners, and for a moment, I hesitated. But the whispering was insistent, and I stepped out, curiosity pushing me forward. I squinted into the gloom, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had caused the commotion. Nothing. The hallway lay silent and empty, the gas lamps flickering low, casting distorted shapes on the walls. I took a cautious step forward, peering down the corridor. The air was heavy, laden with an unshakable tension. Then, in the distance, I spotted a figure at the end of the hall, standing just outside the door to the attic. My heart leaped. Was it Clara? But as I approached, the figure vanished, swallowed by the shadows. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden urge to retreat. The knocking faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness that filled the air. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to return to the safety of my room. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my racing heart. What had I just seen? Or had I imagined it entirely? I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. I was a writer, trained to observe and document, yet here I was, caught in the grip of fear and uncertainty. After a long moment, I returned to bed, but sleep evaded me. Every creak of the inn sounded like footsteps. Every whisper felt like a voice calling from beyond. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift and dance, taunting me with their secrets. Morning arrived slowly, the soft light filtering through my window like a gentle reminder of the world outside. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and tried to shake off the remnants of the night's terror. Perhaps it was time to find some fresh air. I made my way down to the common room, hoping to find the Bennets or Clara, eager to share my strange experience. But the room was empty, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire in the hearth. Mrs. Hawthorne emerged from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour. "Good morning, dear," she said, her eyes brightening. "How did you sleep?" "Not great, to be honest," I admitted. "I thought I heard something in the night." Her expression shifted, a shadow crossing her face. "Ah, yes, you must have heard the knocks. They come and go." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "It's just the unsettling, dear. Nothing to worry about," she said, but I sensed the edge in her tone. "But tell me, did you see Clara?" "Clara?" I frowned. I thought she was here. I wanted to ask her about her stay. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression darkened. "Clara checked out early this morning. Just vanished into thin air, it seems. Poor girl was so troubled." "Vanished?" I echoed, feeling the weight of her words. "But I saw her last night." Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head. "Strange things happen in this inn, Mr. Turner. Some guests leave behind more than just their belongings." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Clara's presence lingered in my mind, her troubled look and the urgency in her voice. What had she been trying to say? I decided to search for the Bennets, hoping they might have seen Clara or understood more about her sudden departure. I found them in a small nook by the window, their heads close together as they whispered. "Mr. Turner," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, her eyes widening with surprise. "You're just the person we wanted to see." "What happened to Clara?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. Mr. Bennet sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She seemed restless. We noticed her wandering the halls late at night, always looking over her shoulder. Something was troubling her." "Did she mention anything to you?" I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. Mrs. Bennet glanced at her husband, then leaned closer. She spoke of feeling watched, of shadows following her. It seemed like she was haunted by something, but she never fully explained. We thought she might leave early. "But she left without a word," I said, the pieces beginning to click into place. What if something happened to her? Mr. Bennet's face darkened. We've heard tales of guests disappearing from the Willow's Rest. It's a place with a past, a history of lost souls. As the words hung in the air, the fire crackled in the hearth, echoing the tension between us. The stories of the inn felt more than just folklore. They were warnings etched into its very walls. I could no longer dismiss Clara's disappearance as mere coincidence. Determined to uncover the truth about Clara's disappearance, I gathered my resolve and left the Bennets, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on me. I needed to dig deeper into the history of the Willow's Rest and discover what had truly happened to her. Perhaps the answer lay hidden within the inn itself. I returned to my room and retrieved Clara's journal from the previous night, hoping to find clues in her fragmented thoughts and sketches. The pages were filled with her delicate handwriting, a mix of random observations and emotional outpourings. As I flipped through the entries, certain phrases jumped out at me. The shadows watch, I can't escape, and they won't let me go. With each line I read, my sense of urgency intensified. Clara had been trying to tell me something important. I felt a compulsion to learn more about her and the inn, so I decided to seek out Mrs. Hawthorne for guidance. Perhaps she had insight into Clara's last days here. Finding her in the small parlor, I approached with cautious determination. Mrs. Hawthorne, do you know where Clara might have gone? Did she leave any belongings behind? Her things were packed, she said, her brow furrowing. I thought it odd that she left so early, especially after speaking with you. What did she say to you? I asked, leaning closer. Did she mention anything about her past? Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her apron. She spoke of darkness. She said she was being followed by something from her past. Do you think she might have been in danger? I pressed. It's hard to say, she replied slowly, but I know that many guests come to escape their lives and some find that they cannot. The inn has a way of holding on to them. A chill washed over me as I considered her words. What kind of hold did the Willow's Rest have over its guests? I couldn't let Clara become another ghost story. I needed to find her, if not in body, then in spirit. With Mrs. Hawthorne's cryptic advice in mind, I resolved to investigate the inn further. I decided to start in the basement, where I hoped to find old records or artifacts that might shed light on the past. I descended the creaky staircase, each step echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder, and I shivered as I entered the basement, a dimly lit space filled with dust and forgotten memories. Old trunks lined the walls, their contents long abandoned. A faint light flickered from a single bulb overhead, casting ominous shadows that danced across the stone walls. I rummaged through the trunks, sifting through dusty linens and yellowed papers. Among the items I found an old ledger bound in cracked leather. Flipping through the brittle pages, I discovered a record of guests who had stayed at the Willow's Rest over the decades. Some names were familiar, others long forgotten. My heart raced as I stumbled upon an entry dated over 50 years ago. A guest named Clara Henderson had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of her fate. As I read further, I noticed a pattern. Many guests had checked in, only to disappear shortly after. Each name was marked by a date, and the silence that followed was deafening. I pulled out the ledger, a sense of dread creeping in as I realized that this wasn't just a story. It was a cycle. Each entry told a tale of loss, of lives abruptly interrupted, as if the inn had a hunger for despair. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, and I spun around, my pulse quickening. The dim light cast an eerie glow, but I saw no one. Just shadows twisting in the corners, teasing my senses. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence answered me, but something felt different, charged, electric. I decided I had spent enough time in the basement and quickly made my way back upstairs, the ledger clutched tightly under my arm. Once I reached the main floor, I needed to regroup and think. I sought out the Bennets, hoping they might have additional insights. I found Mr. and Mrs. Bennet sitting in the common room, their mugs steaming in front of them. They looked up as I approached, their faces etched with concern. "Alex, you look pale," Mrs. Bennet said, worry creeping into her voice. "What did you find?" I took a seat across from them, the ledger laid out on the table. "I found a ledger in the basement," It lists all the guests who have stayed here, many of whom disappeared. Mr. Bennet leaned closer, a frown deepening on his face. You're serious? Look, I said, opening the ledger to show them the names. There's a pattern, and it includes a Clara Henderson from 50 years ago. She vanished without a trace, just like the others. It's as if something is keeping them here. Mrs. Bennet gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh dear, I thought it was just stories. But it's not just stories, I insisted. I think Clara, our Clara, was trying to tell us something before she left. I felt her presence last night, and I believe she's still here. What do you mean? Mr. Bennet asked, a spark of interest lighting his eyes. When I was in the basement, I felt a strange energy, I explained. It's like the inn is alive, and it's holding on to these memories, these spirits. Clara is trapped here, and I need to find a way to help her. Mrs. Bennet exchanged a worried glance with her husband. You need to be careful, Alex. There are forces at play that we don't understand. We've heard stories of those who tried to confront the spirits. Some didn't return. I shook my head, frustration rising within me. I can't just sit here and do nothing. If Clara is still here, I owe it to her to help. Then we'll help you, Mr. Bennet said resolutely. We've lived in Ashcroft Hollow long enough to know the stories, and we may have some tools that can aid you. I felt a surge of gratitude. Together, we could uncover the truth and perhaps free Clara's spirit from whatever darkness bound her to the inn. As we formulated a plan, I realized that the only way forward was to confront the past, to unearth the truth buried within the walls of the Willow's Rest. I needed to know what had happened to Clara Henderson all those years ago, and I was willing to risk everything to find out. The evening air turned crisp as we prepared for the ritual, gathering items that had been passed down through generations among the locals. Mrs. Bennet retrieved a small box from the attic, filled with candles and herbs used for protection and cleansing. We'll need to create a safe space, she said, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the items on the dining table. This will help us focus our energy and invite Clara's spirit to communicate. Will this work? I asked, a mix of hope and skepticism swirling within me. Many believe that it can, Mr. Bennet replied, his expression serious. But we must approach this with respect. Spirits are not to be trifled with. As twilight descended, the atmosphere shifted, thickening with anticipation. We lit the candles, their flickering flames casting shadows that danced on the walls. The room grew warmer, charged with an energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Clara, if you can hear us, I called softly, we're here to help you. We know what happened to you, and we want to set you free. For a moment, silence enveloped us. I could hear my heart racing, the weight of uncertainty heavy in the air. But just as I began to lose hope, a breeze swept through the room, extinguishing a candle near the window. I felt a chill race down my spine. Clara? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Stay calm, Mrs. Bennet instructed, her eyes wide with both fear and determination. She's trying to communicate. As the air thickened with tension, I felt a presence, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The remaining candles flickered wildly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. Clara, if you're here, show us a sign, I urged, feeling a strange compulsion to connect. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the air crackled with energy. A soft whisper filled the room, echoing like a distant memory. Help me, please. Clara, I exclaimed, my heart racing. We're here. What do you need? Trapped, must remember. The voice was faint, filled with sorrow, but it resonated deeply within me. Trapped, I echoed, glancing at the Bennets, who nodded in understanding. What do you need us to remember? There was a pause, then the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows twisted around us. In the flickering candlelight, I saw a figure forming, a silhouette of a woman, her features indistinct yet undeniably familiar. It was Clara, her face a mask of anguish. Help me, she whispered, her eyes pleading. You must find the truth. The attic holds my memories. Before I could respond, the figure faded, the air growing still once more. I turned to the Bennets, my heart pounding. The attic, we need to go there. With renewed determination, we gathered our things and made our way to the attic. As we climbed the narrow staircase, I felt a pull, as if Clara's spirit was guiding us, urging us to uncover her hidden past. The attic door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with dust and forgotten relics of the past. Old furniture, trunks, and boxes filled with cobwebs were piled haphazardly around us. I felt a rush of energy, a sense of purpose surging through me. Clara's memories must be here, I said, scanning the room for any sign of her presence. We need to search everything. We split up, rifling through the boxes and trunks. I opened a trunk that was half hidden beneath a dusty quilt, revealing stacks of old letters tied with a fraying ribbon. As I began to read, I realized they were letters from Clara Henderson, recounting her time at the Willow's Rest. Each letter revealed her inner turmoil, descriptions of nightmares, the feeling of being watched, and the persistent shadows that haunted her nights. It became clear that she was not just escaping her life. She was fleeing something sinister. "Alex, look at this," Mrs. Bennet called from the other side of the attic. I rushed over to find her holding an old photograph. It depicted a group of guests from decades ago, Clara Henderson among them. In the background, I noticed a figure, a shadowy silhouette lurking near the window, almost obscured. My heart raced. "What is that?" Mr. Bennet leaned in closer, studying the photograph. Could it be a previous guest? Someone who was here when Clara disappeared? "Maybe it's connected to her story," I suggested, examining the details. "This could be the key to understanding what happened." As we explored further, I stumbled upon an old journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, I found entries chronicling Clara's growing fear and paranoia, culminating in her last entry, a frantic plea for help. "I can't stay here. The shadows are closing in. I fear I may not leave," she had written, her handwriting frantic and uneven. A cold wave of dread washed over me as I realized the truth. Clara hadn't just vanished. She had been consumed by the very darkness she had feared. "Alex, we need to find a way to free her," Mr. Bennet urged, his voice tense. "We can't let her spirit be trapped here any longer." I nodded, feeling the weight of our task pressing upon us. "What if we perform a ritual to release her? It could help her find peace." Mrs. Bennet rummaged through the attic and retrieved a small cloth pouch filled with herbs and crystals. "This should help. It's meant to purify and protect." As we gathered around, we began the ritual, focusing our energy on Clara's spirit, calling out to her with sincerity. "Clara, we are here for you. We wish to help you find peace and release you from this darkness." The air thickened and the shadows seemed to converge around us. A voice echoed, a blend of sorrow and relief. "Thank you. Please, I'm ready." In that moment, I felt a rush of energy as if Clara's spirit was enveloping us, filling the room with warmth and light. I closed my eyes, letting the sensations wash over me. With each word of the ritual, I felt her presence growing stronger, a light breaking through the veil of darkness. "You are free, Clara," I called out, my voice resonating with hope. Then, the shadows began to recede, their grip loosening as a bright light illuminated the attic. I could feel Clara's spirit lifting, her energy merging with the light, a final farewell. "Thank you," her voice echoed softly, and then she was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight of fear lifting. We stood in the attic, breathing heavily, the remnants of the ritual still lingering in the air. "Is it over?" Mrs. Bennet whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I think so," I replied, my heart swelling with relief. "We did it. Clara is free." As dawn broke over Ashcroft Hollow, the world felt different, lighter, as if the shadows had finally released their hold. I found myself standing by the window of my room, watching the sun rise over the hills, illuminating the path forward. The Bennets joined me, their faces reflecting the hope I felt within. "What do we do now?" Mr. Bennet asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "We honor Clara's memory," I said. "We share her story, ensuring that others know the truth of this place. The Willow's Rest can become a sanctuary rather than a prison." They nodded in agreement, the weight of our experience settling into purpose. Together, we began to pack our things, ready to leave the haunted inn behind. As we made our way down the stairs, Mrs. Hawthorne appeared, her expression a mix of confusion and relief. "What happened? You all look as if you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps we have," I replied with a smile, the warmth of the sun shining down upon us. "But we've set things right." We left the Willow's Rest behind, stepping into the light of a new day. Clara's spirit had found peace, and I felt a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. As we drove away, I glanced back at the inn, its silhouette fading into the distance. I knew the stories of lost souls would continue, but now they would be met with compassion and understanding, a reminder of the power of connection and the importance of listening. And as we traveled the winding road ahead, I couldn't help but feel that Clara was finally free, her story no longer bound by the shadows of the Willow's Rest. Months passed since that fateful night, but the impact of our experience remained. I began writing about my journey, sharing Clara's story with others, and ensuring that her spirit lived on in the hearts of those who read it. The Willow's Rest was transformed into a place of healing, a haven for weary travelers seeking solace rather than escape. I often returned, working alongside the Bennets to share the history of the inn and the lessons learned from Clara's plight. Each guest who entered was welcomed warmly, their stories embraced, creating an environment where shadows no longer held power. Instead, light and love flourished, weaving a tapestry of hope that would echo through generations. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the Willow's Rest, I felt Clara's presence, a gentle whisper of gratitude, a reminder that even the darkest shadows can give way to the brightest light.